Okay, good morning and welcome. The time is now 8:30, and I'd like to call the December 13th, 2024 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council to order. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Kent Howe,
Here.
Cindy Condon,
Here.
Marcy Grail,
Here.
Ann Byer,
Here.
Katie Imes.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. I have the following. Well, wait, first of all, are there any agenda modifications?
Mr. Chair, there are no agenda modifications at this time.
Okay, thank you. I have the following announcements. For council members and anyone addressing the council, please remember to state your name clearly, and please do not use the speakerphone feature as it will create feedback. Please mute your phones, and if you are joining us by phone and receive a phone call, please hang up from this call and dial back in after finishing your other call. For those signed in onto the webinar, please do not broadcast your webcam. For agenda item D, public comment period, there are 3 ways to let us know you're interested in providing comments to the council. For those in person, please fill out a registration card and submit to Nancy Hatch. For those using the WebEx, you'll need to use the raise your hand feature. And for those on the phone only, you'll need to press *3, which will alert us that you want to speak. We'll go over those options again during that agenda item. If you want to receive future email notifications of council meetings, project milestones, or rulemakings through our Click Dimensions program, you can do so by clicking on the link in the agenda or on the council webpage. Look for the green box on the right-hand side of the page that says sign up for email updates. You're also welcome to access the online project mapping tool in any documents by visiting our website. Please note that the audio and video of this meeting is being recorded and may be posted to the council's website following the meeting. Energy Facility Council meetings shall be conducted in a respectful and courteous manner where everyone's allowed to state their positions at the appropriate times, consistent with council rules and procedures. Willful, accusatory, offensive, insulting, threatening, insolent, or slanderous comments which disrupt the council meeting are not acceptable. Pursuant to Oregon Administrative Rule 345-011-0080, any person who engages in unacceptable conduct which disrupts the meeting may be expelled. Okay, so we're ready for the consent calendar approval of minutes. Do we have a motion on the minute approval?
Chair Howe,
Yeah, Councilor Byer.
I move that we accept the minutes for October 2024 as presented.
Okay, do we have a second? Yeah. I think she
I was doing,
separate.
do we want 2 motions?
There are options, so you can either do them as a combined motion.
Okay.
So there's one version of that, and there are also separate motions. It really depends on if you want to make any changes.
Yeah.
If you don't want to make any changes, probably easier just to do both of them at the same time.
Okay, so I would amend my motion to approve both the October 2024 and November 24 minutes as presented, and move their approval.
Chair Howe,
Councilor Grail.
may I just say that, so I did not attend the November meeting, so I wasn't going to vote on that, so I don't know if that affects your.
Another good, so maybe not just the fact that there might be changes, but not everybody was at all the meetings. So maybe, sorry, my apologies, maybe it is better to go back and do individual meeting minutes.
Okay, so Chair
Councilor
Howe,
Meyer.
I move that we accept the October 2024 council minutes as presented by staff.
Okay, we've got a motion. Do we have a second?
This is Chair Grail, or Councilmember Grail. I second that.
Okay, Secretary Cornett, we've got a motion and a second. Could you please call the roll?
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Kent Howe.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do we have another motion?
Chair Howe, I move that we accept the November 2024 council meeting minutes as presented by staff.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Chair Howard,
Vice Chair
second.
Condon.
Thank you. Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Could you please call the roll?
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Abstain.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Katie Imes.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Cornett, do you have a council report?
I do, Mr. Chair. First, some staffing and council updates. I've probably talked about this in the past. We have maintained an additional vacant senior siting analyst position. We've had that for several biennia as a limited duration. This is the first biennium that we've had it as a permanent position. But because these positions are largely fee driven, we have to have the forecasted workload to ensure that, it will be largely paid for by fees. We've made that determination and we've just initiated the recruitment. So that should go out in the coming weeks or so, just before the holidays. Hopefully we'll have that position filled in early 2025. And so that would mean we will have 5 senior siting analysts to work on applications and amendments. And then in terms of replacing Councilmember Chalktoot, still no updates on that. The governor's office is very much interested in having tribal representation on the council. We've reached out to tribal governments, I've had a couple conversations, but nothing as of yet. So if anybody has any good contacts with any of the tribal governments, then please make those contacts and let them know that we are looking for somebody to fill that position. And certainly they can contact me.
Counselor Byer?
As I recall, you put in a position for an additional compliance position. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you, Councilmember Byer. That is in the budget for this year. So we don't have that position yet. We've made the request. So, it has to go through a series of sort of stage gates. The first is it has to be kind of agreed upon by the agency. That was done, has to make it into the budget. And the sort of the latest stage gate is, and I don't remember the date, but it's not been too long ago, the governor has issued her budget and it is included in that budget.
Right.
So obviously no guarantees, but, we made similar argument that, we have enough compliance work. You've heard the updates before, that we have enough compliance work to fund that position. So hopefully it'll move through, but it'll require going through the legislative process and require the legislature to adopt that budget as well.
So July 2020.
Yeah, if everything works out well, then as of July 1, 2025, we would have the authority to initiate recruitment. A lot of other agencies may have positions that they're pushing at that time. Some things have to go through the Department of Administrative Services first before they get back to the agency. So the timing of all that is unknown at this point in time, but theoretically, starting July 1st, if it gets approved, we can move forward with that.
Thank you for the update.
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you for the report. Just a question on the position for senior siting analyst. So given that you've determined that a senior siting analyst is needed, how do you make that determination? Are you determining how many projects we're going to have and what stages they'll be in? And so is there an increase of X amount or?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a forecast, which is, what are we looking at in the next several years? And, part of that is, pretty clear and some of it's not as clear, and so it is a bit of a, again, guesswork. But right now we have a lot of project work. We could use a body right now. We probably could have used it for a while. So really the question is, what's the cycle? Are we going to see, any downturns, any significant upturn? Problem ends up being is that if we hit a significant upturn, and then by the time we then react to that, we're 3-4 months out in terms of the recruitment, 6 months out in terms of getting somebody on board, bringing them up to speed, and then there's always work associated with doing all of that. So we do believe that the kind of the continued workload cycle will, probably continue to go up. We're seeing there's a lot of push, at the state level for renewable energy. We've seen that transmission. We keep hearing transmission is going to be a big deal and there's going to be needed transmission. So should we get more transmission projects, and those are always complicated, that would be needed. And, if we end up being wrong and we don't have that, there's plenty of compliance work as we forecasted. So there's not really a shortage of fee work that can be done, whether it's applications, amendments, or compliance.
Thanks. There's a lot we don't see here, and I'm just curious what you hear before there's a notice of intent or anything
Yeah.
else that kind of bubbles up for your determination,
Yeah,
what
we do
is-
have a lot of conversations, with potential developers. Some of those come in, some of those don't come in. So, we don't necessarily just rely on the fact that somebody says they're going to submit a notice of intent, because that doesn't always happen, but that does influence us. And then we track what's happening, in the regional, kind of at the regional level and also at the federal level. And again, transmission, it's all about transmission. Everybody's talking about transmission right now.
Thank you.
I have several project updates. The first is on the Boardman coal plant. So this was a 550 megawatt facility located in Morrill County. It ceased operation in October 2020. Because the site certificate predated decommissioning requirements, Portland General Electric was not required to decommission it consistent with council rules. We obviously spent a lot of time in terms of what the decommissioning elements are. It's just old enough where it didn't include those rules. But because Portland General Electric is a regulated utility and they have an obligation under the Public Utility Commission to decommission facilities, they have been doing that since 2020. So they have recently submitted, PGE has recently submitted their request to terminate the site certificate. So we wouldn't even entertain that until the decommissioning has been done and any elements within the conditions associated with the site certificate were met. So they have submitted that. We are currently reviewing that. We think that will be at the January council meeting. But just to give you a heads up, no specific updates on that, just a general, that's likely to be coming in January.
Chair Powell?
Counselor Byer.
So will we get a finding from the PUC that they have met the PUC decommissioning requirements?
We'll take a look at that. We're certainly
Right.
ask them for their information, so we'll be analyzing all of that.
Okay, thank you.
Next is the Boardman to Hemingway Amendment Determination request. So I've provided several updates at prior council meetings. So if you recall, this was the proposal to relocate equipment approved to be located adjacent to the Bonneville Power Administration's Longhorn Station to a new location 15 miles south adjacent to Pacific Core Station, which is called the Maverick Station. And the new location would have been would be in the micrositing corridor as well. So the request was, because of that, an amendment, it would not be triggered. It was, her current location is approved in a micrositing corridor. The future location would be in the micrositing corridor. Therefore, their request was, we don't have to go through an amendment, right? And so we have been evaluating that until they just withdrew it on November 21st. So that is no longer active. Next is the Daybreak Solar Amendment Determination request. I've also provided some updates on this at prior council meeting. So this facility is an under construction 140 megawatt solar PV generating project in Wasco County, east of Maupin. The certificate holder is Daybreak Solar LLC, which is a subsidiary of Avangrid Renewables. The ADR is related to a financial institution acquiring legal title for some of the facility equipment and then leasing that back to the certificate holder pursuant to a long-term lease. So the certificate holder would continue to control, possess, and operate the facility even though they didn't own that. It was being leased back to them. So on November 20th, the department issued a determination confirming that the proposed changes would not warrant a review through the site certificate amendment process. So that determination was posted to the department's project webpage, and we sent out a courtesy electronic notice to recipients on that. This was also sent out to council. But importantly, and I'll just read the rule, per OAR 345-027-0357 sub 6, at the request of any council member, the department must refer its determination to the council for concurrence, modification, or rejection. So this is the same on all ADRs related to, whether an amendment is required or not. So we've determined that an amendment is not required. We've sent that out. But pursuant to that rule, if any council member believes that you, the council, would like to review that, we would bring that back before you at a future council meeting. So, if anybody's interested, please let us know today or in the very near future, so that we can decide, which council meeting that would come back on. I don't know that there would be enough. Oh,
No, I mean, for.
yeah. Yeah. So but you're not obligated to, it would be helpful if you decide you want that today, so we could add to the January agenda. But if you come back on Monday and say, hey, I do want to see that, there's still time to add it to the January agenda.
I asked for statement.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. Do we have any other facilities that have this same framework where it's a leaseback arrangement
Not that I'm aware of.
that has been considered? I guess I would like to think about it more and how that plays out. Given that we haven't addressed it before, I guess, I'm a little uncertain about it again, say that. So, and I'm not sure why. It's a different structure. And how does it affect us, for 30 years, or the site for 30 years? So, thanks. No, I'm not suggesting anything, but I might be in touch on Monday.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say just, again, there's nothing in the rule that says what the timing is, but the fact that we've issued it, we would want to know relatively soon. And best case scenario is that early enough to get it on the January agenda if anybody is interested.
Councilor Byer?
Thank you, Chair Howe. I just want to note that we did receive a memo from Patrick and Sarah sort of outlining the legal ramifications and context for this kind of provision. I agree with the legal analysis, but this is enough different that I too have some qualms and questions about what that does for our financial assurances template moving forward. As I understand the memo, the certificate holder retains control and responsibility and is still, shall we say, on the hook for decommissioning, but it is a different animal than we've seen before. So, but thank you very much for the memo that really kind of clarified things.
It sounds like are you asking to bring this up in January then for your concurrence, or are you still thinking about it?
Based on the analysis, I am fine with this, but if anybody else wants to consider it and bring it forward, but I do want us to think about this in the context of other financial assurances that we see moving forward. But I'm comfortable with this project based on your analysis.
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. I don't remember from the analysis, but have we seen the underlying documents?
We have portions of the lease. We have the portions of the lease that are relevant to the analysis that we needed to make as to whether or not an amendment would be required.
Okay, thanks. I might be back to you on Monday, and I'm not sure I have an issue with it, but just want to think about it again and re-look at the analysis. But it's different enough. For me to have some concern. Thanks.
Another amendment determination request on the Wagon Trail Solar Project. So this is an approved, recently approved, but not yet constructed 500 megawatt solar PV facility in Morrow County. The ADR seeks review of a proposed change to the battery energy storage system to change up to 15 megawatts of the 500 megawatts of battery storage from lithium ion to zinc bromide electrolyte. So the zinc bromide electrolyte is technology that is fully recyclable within the existing system and does not require heating, ventilation, or air conditioning, and reduces the auxiliary load and operational noise. So there's clearly some benefits. I think, we've talked before, and it's on my list. There is, variations in battery storage technologies. That's on my list to kind of do that kind of evaluation and bring that back at a future council meeting. So that might be helpful when considering these things. But as indicated, this is I think a less impactful technology, and it's not all of the facility, just a portion of it. So on November 22nd, the department issued its determination confirming that the proposed changes would not warrant a site certificate amendment. So the department's determination was posted on the project's website. We sent out a courtesy email notification, and this was also sent to council. And then consistent with, as I'd stated previously, with the same administrative rule, at the request of any council member, we can bring this back up at a future council meeting on the agenda for your evaluation and options of concurrence, rejection, or modifications. Any questions on that?
That's all right.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. Has this kind of amendment come before the council in the past?
Amendment or amendment determination request?
Amendment determination request?
I don't think
battery
this-
Storage?
I don't think this
Stage?
particular type of one, would then, typically what we see in an application is at least two different types of technologies for battery storage. I think there's just enough questions about what's the future of battery storage that they're kind of hedging their bets. It may take some time before they begin construction. They may not even do the battery storage initially. So I think there's just a lot of kind of research and development on which the best battery storage will be in the near future. So typically what we see is a couple of different versions of battery technology already in the application. I think this is different in that they didn't include this particular technology in the application. Now they're wanting to add it. And, really the question is, are there, and we've talked about the three coulds, could impact a finding, could impact a condition, could, result in, impact that wasn't previously evaluated from council. Those are really the sort of drivers for when an amendment is necessary. And in this case, because the technology would be less impactful and within the same site and the same locations, and again, only a portion of the amount of the battery storage, our conclusion was an amendment was not needed. Now, if we determine, hey, this is, has more fire danger, or they're putting it outside the site boundary, or we don't have adequate conditions necessary to deal with this type of technology, the answer would have been no. You got to go through the amendment process so we can evaluate what those potential impacts are.
And so they want to use possibly different types of battery storage technology. Okay.
And that's what they've indicated. Again, I think the reality is, with almost all these facilities, what happens with battery storage, we'll see.
Thank you.
Okay, next is the Obsidian Solar Center project. On November 20th, we received requests for amendment 2. This is an approved but not yet constructed 400 megawatt solar PV facility with 50 megawatts of battery storage and related and supporting facilities located on 6.4 square miles in North Lake County. So certificate holder is Obsidian Solar Center LLC, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Obsidian Renewables LLC. So the facility was approved in February of 2022. And since they have not begun construction yet, the amendment requests to extend the beginning and ending construction deadlines by 3 years. And then additionally, as part of their amendment request, they included an amendment determination request, which would be that the amendment gets reviewed under the type B process rather than the type A process. Which again, the difference is there's some faster timelines. There's no draft proposed order hearing in the vicinity of the project. There's still a draft proposed order and a comment period, just not a public hearing in front of council. And then there's no opportunity for a contested case. So since we just got those, we're just in the initial stages of reviewing them. But we provided the courtesy, the amendment process requires notice, which we've done. And that included the amendment determination request information. And all of this has been put on the project page. So still in the early stages of this one. And yet another amendment determination request to go through periods of little to none to a lot, and we have a lot right now. So on December 9th, we received an amendment determination request for the Montag Wind Power Facility. This is an operational 201 megawatt wind power project in Gillum County. The certificate holder is Montag Wind Power Facility LLC, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Avangrid Renewables. The ADR seeks basically the determination of whether an amendment is required for the construction of a building in the O&M area. And this would be a 18 by 36-foot shed with a concrete pad. The shed would be located adjacent to the Leaning Juniper 2B O&M building. And because these are all owned by essentially Avangrid, they have some shared facilities. They're all in the same location, and rather than having all of the separate O&M, they have some shared operations and maintenance facilities, and we have conditions in each one of them related to that. And we've spent time previously on making sure that those conditions are correct, that if one facility goes away, the other facilities still have the requirements associated with that. So since we just got this one, we just started reviewing it, but similarly, we put it on the project page and we provided a courtesy email, even though we're not required to provide an email on ADRs, we did yesterday. So this one's still very new. Next, the 2025 legislative process is in full swing, even though we're not in 2025 yet. Just to give you an update there, we've talked before about this. There will likely be numerous bills related to FSEC and siting. And one of those early that we're reviewing, just to give you an idea of some of the elements that are in there, would be eliminating FSEC jurisdiction for projects that are located entirely on federal lands. That has been brought up in the past. Mandating that the time from issuance of proposed order and notice of contested case through a final decision by council can be no longer than 12 months. Allowing for minor changes to a site boundary without requiring an amendment. If you recall on that, we actually do have rules related to that. Those were challenged, and the Supreme Court determined that council didn't have that legal authority. So that would be creating a legal authority through statutes to allow that. Mandating that beginning and ending construction dates can be approved without any substantive review is another element. And then clarifying the appeal path on all FSEC orders. This is something that we've seen with some recent projects. And so I think there's a lot of interest in that. So this surely won't be the full universe of things related to FSEC, but just to give you a preview of some of the things that we're likely to see in bills. And then the last thing on my list is the next council meeting. We did talk about the January meeting. So we have already put forth a draft agenda to Chair Howe, and he's approved it, and that meeting will be on January 17th, which is a Friday here. There are no locational drivers for that, so that will be here in this same room on January 17th, and we'll get that information out in the very near future. And with that, I'm concluding my secretary report.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary Cornett. The next item is the Land Conservation and Development Commission's Eastern Oregon Solar Siting Possibilities Rulemaking. It's an action item. We've got Tom Jackman, the Rules Coordinator, to present this to us.
All right, so yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about the LCDC rulemaking that has been underway for the last year. And just to go through the agenda here a little bit, we're going to talk about why we're even bothering going through it, as well as the question about strategically why, even if you accept that the council should review this rulemaking, why are we doing it now and not later? And we'll get to that as well. But first here, to roll us back even farther, it's important to understand that the council has oversight directed by the legislature to review related rulemaking that could have an impact on energy facility development, and requires other agencies to file a copy of their proposed rules with the council. And the council's then directed, it's interesting phrasing here, but it says may order such changes as it considers necessary to conform to state policy, as stated in ORS 469010 and ORS 469.310. So I just think it's interesting that it doesn't say has to order such changes as it considers necessary, but there is some flexibility here. However, this review process is mandatory. So one of my bullets on my position description is that I keep an eye on other agency rulemaking so that in the event one of these comes along, I can let other agencies know, because a lot of them aren't aware, and I don't know why they necessarily would be, but we do our best to keep them aware and keep them in the loop. Like, hey, it looks like this may have some relation to citing, and so we cite them to this ORS 469.320 and just let them know that the council needs to be kept in the loop. So, any questions about that or no? Okay, so let's go through the two. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Chair Howe.
You do it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Just really on the
Yeah.
use of may, what would prompt, what do you think would prompt us to consider something was necessary and then choose not?
Well, let's go through the two things that the council has to review the rules to ensure compliance with. So, and then maybe that will help you answer the question. So the first policy that council is reviewing the rules to determine if they need to change the rules so that they comply with the policy is 469.010. And I just pulled a little bit of the language from sub A here because it's, gives you the subject matter, but it relates to the development and use of sustainable energy resources in the state of Oregon. So, and that they be encouraged to the highest degree possible in the private sector. So if the rule was to discourage the use of a diverse array of permanently sustainable energy resources or make it more difficult for the private sector to do so, then that would be an instance where council would step in. Why a rule like that would exist, but then you would choose not to? Perhaps there's some overriding thing, public safety, or some other factor that would lead you to believe, yeah, this is technically against, the spirit or the letter of what this policy is for, but there's overriding factors. You're on, Chair.
Conflict of statutes, could that be?
Sure. I mean, I'm not at the I would go to Patrick on this one. Okay. Who's gone, but
There he goes.
but I mean, clearly the legislature put that word in there on purpose and envisioned. I mean, you always want to be careful. I think about this from a rules perspective. When you're saying shall or must, you want to be 100% sure that, because you're taking away, flexibility, right? So sometimes you don't want things to be flexible, and so, but, this is a very broad, agencies are empowered to draft their own rules, and so just to empower the council to say, hey, you have to change that, I think it's appropriate that they gave the council discretion to sort of think about the implications of that, and not, kind of force them to step on other people's toes, so to speak.
And just,
That's just me speaking personally.
well, and from a process perspective, I would presume, as we have learned, is that if we considered something was necessary,
Sure.
that we'd have to explain why we were saying, yes, it's necessary, but we're not.
Yeah,
gonna-
we reviewed this and we feel like you need to change this provision because it violates the, one of these two policies.
Right. But if we decide not to, we need to provide
Oh,
some
the reason,
reasoning.
the basis
to-
for that?
Yeah.
Again, I would defer to Patrick on that, but presumably
Thank
they
you.
would want to know. But
Just trying to understand process more and more.
yeah, we ask other agencies for their thoughts and feelings on our stuff all the time. So, yeah, it would totally be appropriate for council to say, here's what we think, here's why we're not doing this or whatever, whatever context would be needed to understand council's feelings.
Thanks.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so then the other policy that the rules need to be in compliance with, or the council is reviewing the rules to ensure the compatibility with, relates to the protection of the public and environment. So I was thinking there could be potentially a conflict between these two. Is the most obvious instance where council would maybe not make a decision, even though one of the policies was being violated. But this is pretty standard. Go ahead.
For the record, Todd Cornett. And I think it's good to look at these two policies, and really this is kind of the culmination of, I think, what council is supposed to do is, it's not just you're here to approve projects. That is not what you're here for. And you're not here to deny projects. It is the difficulty of evaluating large-scale energy projects that are important and needed for the state, but to the extent that we need to minimize the impacts of those facilities in terms of where they're sited, how they're sited, what the conditions are, how the decommissioning. So there's a constant tension, and it was created that way. And I think there's value in that. Is we want and we need, these energy projects, but they can be incredibly impactful. So inherent within what you're supposed to do is really these two policies. And I think this is exactly what the point is here, is why do you have the authority to tell other agencies you need to make changes? It's because, those agencies may be, all energy projects are good projects, or, protection of these resources are the single most important thing, because a lot of agencies are very singular. You're not. You are looking at all of these things simultaneously, and it's very complex. And you see, based on the participants in our process, you're in the way, make it faster, get out of the way, or you shouldn't allow these things to happen. Your role is a lot more complex than that. And I think that's really the whole point of this, is that you can be looking at both of these policies and those other potential rules and trying to figure out what it means to the entire approach, not just one thing or the other. And I think that's what gets to the May is complex. And we're not exactly sure how a particular rule will apply, and whether, you should say no or, tell them to make different, propose different rules on that. But I think it's just the complexity, and the inherent nature of what FSEC does.
Well said. Exactly right. So, and then I think the other thing is kind of the question that I was thinking about through and continue to think about as I've been observing the rulemaking that we're about to discuss is essentially, if this was to be implemented as drafted, how would that implicate the siting process? So would it make our jobs harder, or maybe impossible in some ways? Maybe the direction is unworkable or vague. And it would, to me, those types of scenarios would implicate, our ability, the council's ability to review projects. I know one of the struggles has been, how to best apply the goal exceptions. So if there was like a rule that made it even harder to figure out, well, does a goal exception apply here? I think there's a good argument that could be made that would be in violation, because it makes it harder for you to figure out whether you should approve, whether the council should approve a project. So, yeah, any other questions on the sort of the background, the framework of why we're here? Yeah.
Counselor Imes.
I do have a question about the rack. Are you gonna get into that maybe later?
Yeah, I'll talk about this specific rule we're making, right now, essentially.
Yeah, okay,
So if you have questions about that. Yeah,
okay.
definitely.
Counselor Byer.
So am I correct that these proposed rules would apply to the non-FSEC jurisdictional projects and the rulemaking itself would not directly affect the FSEC standards and the statutes that we operate under in our administrative rules?
So that's a very complicated question
I knew it was.
that we have
'cause
been
that's
struggling
been-
with.
Yeah,
But just from a sort of, regardless of what they actually do, to the extent that they're altering sort of local, rules and regulations about citing energy projects that we wouldn't necessarily, because they're under the threshold, we wouldn't be forced to review. The citing council, or you, or, if you apply those rules, people can
Yeah.
opt in, have you
Right.
review those projects. And then there is also a sort of, to the extent that these rules touch on, the goal exception, or they are, after a year of talking with all these subject matter experts, sort of decisions are made about what's important or how to balance interests. Those sort of conclusions could, people could say, well, that should apply to these projects too. So even if it doesn't necessarily say in so many words, and this shall also apply to FSEC, there are, sort of degrees of, influence that could impact our process. And I don't know if you had any other, no? Okay.
so just on the record, that's what makes me nervous about this rulemaking and how we apply these statutes, okay? Because if it changes the overall dynamic, that's going to raise different issues for me.
Yeah.
Secretary Cornett.
For the record, Todd Cornett. So normally, any LCDC rules or statutes apply when, through your land use standard.
Yes.
And that's either because the local government has adopted those or they apply directly. So, I think there's still some, are these going to apply in that way or not? And if they do, I think the proposal is to include some additional kind of review criteria and evaluation, and I would say the general framework is that if you have something that applies and it's more conservative, or restrictive, then, and that's coming from LCDC, that would apply, over, say, if theirs was more conservative than your Fish and Wildlife standard. So that's how we would evaluate those. But if it was less so, we would still, and this is what's been done in the past, for example, on the Fish and Wildlife, when, we get a county saying, hey, we have a goal 5 inventory, that was adopted in 1981 that reflects the species that were, present at the time. We say, yeah, but, ours requires an evaluation now, and current. And so we apply that because that's the more conservative approach. So, will these have impacts? Maybe. But again, I don't think it's going to be, and if they are more conservative, we would apply those.
Against the standard for statute. Yeah, okay.
But as Tom's going to indicate, they're still kind of in process.
So,
Yeah.
so Tom, I'm ruminating over something you said that I thought I heard you say. And I may have heard wrong. Was it something like if there's an exception required under the normal process, this rulemaking effort is trying to come up with standards that would not require an exception?
Well, it's not that it wouldn't require an exception. It's that the rules specifically state that this fits under that exception. So it's it's just prescriptively saying that if you're in this category, then you fit this exception. So
Automatic.
you don't need to prove that you fit the exception, but you still fit the exception. Just prescriptively now. Because a lot of these exceptions are a little, they're, as you know, they're sort of vague. And so they're saying, if you meet these, A through Z, then you fit the exception. So, I think there would be some temptation for people to say, well, we fit A through Z. And so even though this isn't, this sub FSEC threshold, that this should apply to us as well. And I wouldn't, I'm not, I couldn't predict how that would play out. So.
Secretary Cornett.
For the record, Todd Cornett. So on that, just as a reminder, the council's land use standard is, the application of LCDC statutes or rules or local government kind of requirements. The one difference is the goal exception.
Yeah.
The council has a different statute
Right.
for goal exception and a different rule. So it comes from a different place. So no matter what happens here, there could be influence, certainly, if there's a lot of conversation and language that talks about what are the elements that can justify a goal exception. We may see that in the future of people applying for that. Council would have to review that and determine whether you agree with that or not. But no matter what LCDC does in this rulemaking, it doesn't change your statutory framework. You still have a separate statute than LCDC on the goal exception. And you have and your rule is, from that statute, and their rule is from their statute. So that is not going to change no matter what. Again, there could be influence. Maybe they come up with great ideas on, what are the elements that maybe justify a goal exception. And those would be things that you want to consider in the future. That absolutely is fine. But from a legal standpoint, this will not impact that at all.
Okay.
Which to foreshadow is largely why staff is offering the recommendation to, not object to the rulemaking. So, but let's get into it a little bit here. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So just as for your information, HB 3409 passed and in 2023 and directed LCDC to adopt rules allowing local governments to consider a photovoltaic solar power generation facility as a rural industrial use to justify an exception under their particular statute. So this sort of, addresses your question of, it's not that it doesn't need an exception, it's just that they've said this meets the exception. So that, okay.
Because it's a rural industrial.
Because it's a rural industrial use, yes. Next slide. So the legislature required them, and this is why they're sort of in a rush, to establish criteria through which local governments may be permitted or required to allow the siting of a photovoltaic solar power generation facility. And they have to do that by July 1st. So they originally were trying to do that by January, and it really, to get ahead of the legislative session, because they were concerned that if they waited till July 1st, that the legislature would be like, well, where is this? We asked for this. But anyway, so they were trying to get in front of that, but this rulemaking ended up being, I think, a bit of a beast. So in terms of the scope. And so anyway, so the criteria that they need to consider are potential conflicts with other resources. And then they were supposed to identify the characteristics of land best suited for the counties to allow, encourage, and incentivize production. Based on, go ahead and go next slide. So this is, again, from the bill. So these were not things that they could be flexible on. The land suitability for contributing to the state's clean energy goals, pretty vague. site characteristics, including resource potential, proximity to current and future transmission access, and locations for potential interconnection, and the ability to readily avoid negative impacts on natural resources and other stuff that we all care about. So I think it's pretty straightforward I think that's probably what the legislature was thinking, but there's sort of actually implementing this has been a challenge. I mean, and essentially it's like, they're asking people to do a site review for projects that don't exist. And it's, yeah.
This is Kent.
Yeah.
And under the LCDC rule process, would they have to do the alternative sites analysis process where we don't?
So what they're doing is they're creating a framework for the counties to do this. So
Right.
LCDC is not doing this.
Well, right, yeah,
Yeah.
so the counties would have to do alternative sites analysis on those provisions there.
I'm not,
Well, the develop, sorry.
So
Yeah.
for the record, Todd Cornett, I'm not sure. I have to go back to look at the draft rules. So what Chair Howe was talking about is within the LCDC's administrative rule related to goal exception. This is the main difference between ours and, or yours rather, and LCDC's is yours does not have an alternatives analysis. LCDC's does. I don't recall in reviewing the draft rules whether they're making changes to that or not.
Okay.
Chair Howe,
Uh,
I believe the
Fire.
intent is to create a goal 5 kind of process to identify those areas that are best suited.
Right,
And that's almost a safe harbor
right.
for not having to do the exceptions,
Yeah.
but the burden is on local government.
Right.
Yeah.
so, I mean, as you know, this is a expensive and time-consuming process. And there's really no way to avoid, if you want to avoid impacts, you can't avoid the work that you need to put in to determine that you can avoid the impacts. So there was, the initial rulemaking effort attempted to just do this, but there was concern by the developers that the counties already, even for site-specific projects, sometimes struggle to marshal the resources or the desire to review these projects. That in the absence of, looming projects, that there would be zero desire, in a world in which there's a billion things fighting for resources and FTE and budget, that no one would, or that certainly some counties would not bother to do this at all. Especially considering some direction from some of the people who are involved who emphasized the may require, that the counties wouldn't necessarily have to do this. This is just creating a framework for them to be able to do this. So then counties could opt into not doing it, and then nothing was accomplished essentially. So halfway through the rulemaking process, they forked out what I'm going to call mini SSEC, because essentially it's a site review by the county under this new framework that they're creating, which is a review of the impacts and the project and all the stuff that council is very familiar with. So that has been its own journey. And in fact, one of the biggest changes between the draft rules that they submitted with the notice of proposed rulemaking and the most recent version that I reviewed is, I mean, it's already super duper confusing and they know it. So one of the things they've done is they've completely split out. There's now 2 sets of rules for if you're gonna do, for counties to do the area review, they're calling it, or for developers to seek a site review. Because they were in the notice of proposed rulemaking version, they're all combined. It's like a, if this, if that, and it's just like a big, huge, wall of text. So now it's if you want to do a site review, go to this section. If you want to, so that has made it, I think, a big difference for me in terms of readability. But yeah, it's been interesting to be a participant in this process. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So yeah, here, this is just what I was saying. So there's now 2 options. A county can review under the current draft rules. A county can review individual applications for solar sites using the adopted administrative rules directly, or a county can adopt a program into their comprehensive plans to designate specific areas, which I believe was the original intent of the legislation, but yeah, for reasons I mentioned that they've sort of created these two different options. And then these thresholds are similar to the AFSEC threshold. So the option 2 is the AFSEC thresholds, and then the option 1 is smaller, which was the old AFSEC threshold. So, any questions about this? No? Good. Because I don't know if I have a whole bunch of answers yet. And this is, I mean, still being worked on. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So there's a variety of issues that have remained. There's been discussions about the community benefits and whether that, counties should allow basically community benefits to influence the decision on whether to designate areas as being suitable. So an area would be more suitable for solar development if a community could benefit. There's my take on this. Obviously, there'd be more incentive by the community to designate the area in that instance, but certainly, I mean, community benefit is a measure of the, achieving the state's goals of, furthering the development and use of renewable energy. So, but yeah, there's been some debates about whether that should be involved. And then I think another big one is mapping. So this is a lot of the discussions, dozens of hours of RAC meetings have been sort of in the abstract, and it kind of, the RAC, I could tell, was getting a little bit frustrated. And then a couple RAC meetings ago, basically people said, I need to see this on a map. I need to see, like, we're saying this is, we're being asked to consider, should we require it within 5 miles of a transmission line or 10 miles of a transmission line? What does that look like? So they are currently, have not released this yet, but have said it's soon. But basically, here's what the current draft rules would look like based on the sort of easily objectifiable criteria, such as distance to transmission line. So that's that's easy to determine. You can just draw a map around. You say, this is 5 miles, this is 10 miles. So so where we have those criteria, or where they've developed those criteria that can be easily mapped, they're going to do so that the RAC can look at it and say, oh, wow, that's 90% of the Eastern Oregon, or that's 2%, or whatever. Any questions about that? No? Okay, next slide. So there's cultural resources, kind of, I feel like, it was like, needs to consider cultural resources, but it was sort of an asterisk, like, to be worked on later, and now it's later. So they're still working that out in terms of determining how the presence of, how you would determine what's a cultural resource, and how communication and collaboration with the tribes about that. So sort of the same things that we deal with. And then there was also some questions about the urban growth boundary, and it may shock you that the developers want to be able to build projects wherever, regardless of what the zoning is, and staff and other agencies are concerned that, obviously there's competing for resources. If you build solar arrays inside the urban growth boundary, you're not building other things. So, including housing. So still working that out. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So there's 2 more RAC meetings after today. And, I've been assured by LCDC that they don't need to reissue a notice of proposed rulemaking, that we're sort of crossing T's and dotting I's, and that the basic framework isn't going to change between now and then. But I don't know. I mean, it'll be what it'll be. So we're going to keep an eye on it. And regardless, we'll be sharing the final language. We'll send that to you. And if we have some concerns about it, then we'll present them to council at a future meeting. If council has any concerns about it, you can ask us to do that proactively, and then we'll, yeah.
Hi, this is Marcy Frail. I just wanted to go back and ask a question, which may be an inappropriate question or an observation. So when I listen, I'm looking at the slide, and we talked about community benefits a little bit. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's always bothered me. So on one hand, we have this notion of what happens here for this community but then we're going to protect the other. And I just, for the record, want to say, I think we have to be objective when we put out statements like, oh, well, we don't want to stop housing or this, that, and the other, because then we're sacrificing somewhere else. I know that's part of our responsibility, but I just want to go on the record and say it's extremely frustrating after listening for 8 years, especially to citizens in Eastern Oregon and their farms. And we talk about negative impacts, but then we don't offset it. So it's not really a question. It's just a comment to say that I'm aware, and I think we should be mindful of indicating any support or opposition as we go through it until we get through the end.
Secretary Cornett?
Yeah, for the record, Todd Cornett, I can probably provide a little more framework on that particular issue and sort of maybe what the drivers are. I mean, I think it's obvious that it makes sense, on the, locational, if, where is energy demand load? It's in urban areas. So it makes sense to put, where you're generating power as close to these urban areas as possible, fewer transmission lines. So from one perspective, that makes perfect sense. From another perspective, the state's land use kind of program is you have, boundaries of cities and you have urban growth boundaries. Those urban growth boundaries are intended to be that 20-year future land supply. And so if you build, all these 30 to 40-year solar projects, that consume a lot of land within that area, that these cities won't be able to, expand into those areas. So it's a tension and a conflict. I think both ideas are valid for very different reasons. So just a little more framework. So, and again, I think it is important to make sure that we understand what those purposes and intents are. And so I think each are valid, but they are in conflict.
And thank you. My logical self completely understands it. But as someone who, again, spends a lot of time in rural areas, and I live in a rural county, I see it very frequently, and I struggle with it with myself, just knowing, I mean, there's still a finite amount of land. We still have to eat. Anyway, it's something I'm super sensitive to. And I think just as we work through it, I just don't want the voice. I want the public to know that we are looking at everything and we're not being myopic in our viewpoint.
Counselor Byer?
Just a couple observations on the rule that LCDC is proposing. They've incorporated provisions for temporary housing as part of the rule that had not been in the solar rule before. And I know housing came up on one of our Morrow County projects. So that's a piece we may want to watch. I really was interested in doing the sort of analysis of the specific sites that could be triggered by Goal 5, and a significant site that linked to transmission lines, which really seems to me to be the driver for the developers. And I will be really interested to see the map of where that aligns in Eastern Oregon. I think there are a couple really big transmission lines, but then maybe not so much in other parts of Eastern Oregon, but I'm only speculating, so that map will be really interesting and will help us understand where those places are that we might see applications in the future. So thanks for participating in this group, and take your vitamins. It'll be done soon.
Yeah, it's been interesting. On that point, one interesting thing I've noted, since you bring it up, is that the bill as passed says, it says something like actual power lines, but also prospective power lines. But the rule language that they've drafted so far only considers built infrastructure. So I haven't asked them why they didn't broaden that, but yeah.
Vice Chair Condon?
Chair Howe, this might be just completely off the field, but given the county's resources to do this, do you or anybody, think that there might be more demands that, just like FSEC can go to other agencies and pay for the expense of the review, is there any expectation that counties might come to FSEC for that review and pay for it? Because they don't have the capability or bandwidth to do it.
For the record, Todd Cornett, good question, Vice Chair Condon. There is a provision, and I have to go find it, so I can't sort of say it off the top of my head. There's a provision in statute that allows for counties to seek assistance from the Oregon Department of Energy, the siting division, in the help of reviewing projects. And there is then some ability to pay for that in the statute. Nobody has previously taken advantage of that. That has existed for some time.
It's right there.
Oh, good. So is that the?
I can just read,
Go
I've
ahead.
got it from me. This is
Yep.
from the bill that authorized LCDC to do this. It says, the Department of Land Conservation and Development may enter into intergovernmental agreements with other state agencies, tribal governments, and counties for the purposes of supporting LCDC in adopting the rules, furnishing information or technical assistance, providing feedback, identifying opportunities to streamline permitting and review processes across and between agencies. I think that's probably what you had in mind.
So
No, that's a new thing. What I'm talking about is something that already exists in statute, that when a county gets an application for an energy facility, they can already seek assistance from ODO, in helping to review that. So this is slightly different, but good to know, because it's kind of along the same lines.
So, and just a follow up to that, I'm just resources for us. I mean, if there were any anticipation for that demand on FSEC resources, citing analysts, that seems to me could affect the number of analysts we have, and we won't see this play out for a while, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
the past does not always, establish what's going to happen in the future, but, this statute has been in existence for quite some time, and nobody's ever taken advantage of it, to my knowledge.
Did we not, this is Marcy,
Councilor Creel.
did we not talk about this when BDH was just getting started with Umatilla County? They seemingly were overwhelmed with I don't know, I actually feel like we've had a conversation about this, and I think you said it then, that they've said they might need help, but we didn't. And then I thought you had talked about maybe having to get a contractor or something to sort through.
Yeah, it's slightly different. So in the context of an application to FSEC, when there's still a lot of demands on local governments, like Boardman Hemingway, when we're seeking their input on their review to help us understand, what their issues and concerns are, and how to implement their land use regulations, they may not have, all of the existing staffing to take that on. And kind of through our statutes, we can help them, obtain those resources. So that's there's 3 versions of these things that we're talking about, but I mean, all is kind of the same thing. Is there's opportunities that people can seek assistance, and I think, to Vice Chair Condon's point is, do we have the resources to provide that? And we would have to evaluate that, so if a county comes to us and says, hey, we got this application, we need some help, could FSEC or ODO provide help? Well, technically, yes, we could. But do we have even the resources to give them? We would have to evaluate it at the time, because obviously we have a lot of demands on our time, and a lot of people are interested in making sure that we're as timely and efficient as possible. So we wouldn't necessarily say, okay, we're going to put a project that's in FSEC's jurisdiction on hold while we help a county work on a county project. We would just have to evaluate what our capacity was.
Follow up.
And counties have the legal authority to also obtain assistance from outside experts as well. So they can hire contractors if they don't have the resources or the expertise. They have that ability. So counties have the authority to create fee structures that will cover the actual or average real cost associated with projects. So there is a lot of options at the county level. But they just have to exercise those.
Yeah, and part of the reason for my question is just what comes up in the RAC from the counties and how, I mean, as I understand this, this is kind of new development for counties. You can do this or you can do this. If there's a preference for option 2, then maybe it's less so. But if there were comments that option 1 was a preferred path, that does demand resource, as we see all the time. And does this new rulemaking then step it up a little bit from what we've seen in the past? I guess that's.
Yeah, and I think any of the other former county planning directors can chime in here as well. But I think the practical reality is the mapping component where the county does it, that is a great model, but it can be impractical in terms of the time and resources for a county to do that. Do they have the money? Do they have political will? Do they have the resources? It's a complex task. And, I think that is probably the best approach. But from a practical standpoint, we've seen this and we've talked about this with the Goal 5 resources at the county level. Most of those were adopted, in the late 70s, early 80s. And for many counties, they've never been changed. Some counties would like to do that, but just don't have the time and the resources, to do that. And so, LCDC, or rather the DLCD, used to have funding for counties to go through that process. That doesn't exist any longer. That dried up a while ago. But it's just resources.
Yeah. So Chair Howe, on that note,
Commissioner Byer.
I know that most counties have the authority when they have a project in front of them to add on a complex project fee that would cover actual costs of review, much like the actual costs of review are done here at FSEC. So on a project-specific basis, there are ways to generate enough revenue. I think the House bill in 2019 put in explicit language to allow the counties to consult with ODFW, and then ODFW would indirectly bill the developer. I think that's the way that process worked, but it was an explicit way to collect resources. The place that, as Todd just said, counties have no money for is the overall land use planning comp plan update, that mapping, that data analysis, which is so critical. Unless DLCD says, we got this great new rule, legislature, you told us to do it. No, we have to fund local governments to do that actual work. And without that funding, it's just, most counties are fee driven and nobody's paying the fee for the actual planning work. So it's just, yeah.
Back on Councilor Grail's kind of opening comment. This is LCDC's or DLCD's effort to kind of come up with a more clear and objective standards and process, I think. But when it comes to community benefit, that's subjective as could be. And are they thinking about obviously could be, how much difference a local government might measure a community benefit from what we, as looking at a statewide interest, might measure a community benefit. And
I don't believe that conversation has come up. I think they're only looking at this from the local perspective. So I don't want to say that 100% that hasn't come up, but I don't recall it coming up. It seems like a lot of the focus has been on just the local perspective, because these rules would be implemented at the local level and would apply to, smaller projects. So, and it'll be interesting to see how much these are even used. One of the developers did say, every single project they're looking at in the state of Oregon for the foreseeable future would exceed the current thresholds. So, it remains to be seen, to the extent these only apply to smaller projects, who's actually going to, be utilizing this new framework. So. I could not even begin to guess. Okay, any other questions?
Counselor Hines.
Thank you. I was curious about the rack and
Huh?
who was on the rack. Do you have more information about that?
So I do have a list of the rack. It's in the meeting packet. And I actually, a couple of the meetings, I took screenshots of who was actually there. I don't have it memorized at the moment, but it was like,
It's in the packet, you said?
well, it was in the packet that they sent to their rack. But I can send it to you. It's also on if you Google Eastern Oregon rulemaking LCDC, it'll take you basically to that rulemaking page, and they have a list of the rack there as well.
So I was really just curious about Eastern Oregon counties and their involvement on that rack.
So that has been a concern in that we're having all this discussion about what the counties are going to do, and that there has not been enough county participation in the rack to hear from people who could say whether or not what we're proposing is actually implementable. So there has been, at least the last I heard was like 2 months ago, there were some discussions about attempts to try to get the counties to get more involved. I know they were invited. If you look at the list of agency and local government RAC members, it's like 30 people, but only like 4 people would show up, and I was one of those. So, yeah, most of the people who were actually there were they call them the voting members, but it was like, energy companies, resource groups, lawyers, a lot of lawyers. So.
I'm looking at the list of what the statute requires the RAC to consist of. And it says the closest categories to a county representative, it says at least one member of the RAC has to represent public bodies. At least one member has to have expertise in rural economic development.
As a voting member?
As a member of the RAC,
Yeah.
I'm just a little concerned to hear that. 4 members, maybe you said, would show up?
Well, of the non-voting, like agency review.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know, maybe
So I would think they would have a voting member representing local counties.
Association of Counties generally represents, or what is the other? So
the only one I ever end up working with is AOC, but yeah, it's difficult to get counties to be involved in RAC. So I wasn't in the effort to get people to join the RAC, so I don't know who they spoke to or what that looked like, but I can forward you, I can track down the list of the people who are actually at the most recent RACs, and you can take a look at it, see who's there.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yep.
Counselor Grail.
So Councilmember Imes, I don't want to speculate, but here's what I think I've witnessed is we are all stretched really, really thin. And we talk about it here, like, oh, if you can. So my suspicion is it's, quote, another meeting. And unless somebody is explicitly like ding, 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 this is really going to impact you. Somebody needs to be present. Like I know our team has made extra effort to reach out to the tribes or something for whatever reason. So I would suspect maybe some feedback to whomever is running this RAC that you might want to really make sure, because you get trucking down the road and then it's like, oh my word, what did we do? That's what in my time here, I've seen happen. It's just, we've just talked about it. The counties, you only have a limited number of bodies. You can only be in one place at one time. Where are you going? And if you think it's just another meeting, yeah, I'll get to that when I'll read the minutes, and then you're playing catch up. So maybe, you've got a lot of connections over there. Maybe it's like, hey, could somebody can we rock, paper, scissors and make sure that one of us is present? So just an observation.
But yeah, so I'll be keeping a really close eye on it, and to the extent it, well, I feel bad because a lot of how things were run, the timeline, who had to be on the RAC, the subject matter, all of this was set out by the legislature. So they kind of had their hands tied in many ways in how they approached this rulemaking and what they had to cover. So it is, I'm glad that I have not been tasked with something similar in scope and timeline. So yeah, go, sure.
This is more an ask than an observation, just if you see places where this rule intersects with FSEC or has the potential to just flag those as they get closer. To me, it's a separate universe, except as Todd pointed out, we do look at local ordinances in implementing as part of our land use standard, but just flag any red flags for us, because like I said, in my brain, they're separate, but there may be those intersects.
So,
Secretary Cornett.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd also bring up that, there's a lot of thought, been going into this, and whether this applies to, your land use standard or not. Maybe there's good things that are coming out of this that we can learn from that could also be, included in future rulemaking. So, things that may be, red flags and concern, but I think on the opposite side, there could also be some really good things. This is, I don't think anybody has looked at this topic with this level of detail, and these types of, resources, ever in the state of Oregon. So there can be also a lot of value that we can learn from. And so I think we need to be open to that as well.
And also things that have already been vetted that we can adjust. Thank you.
Counselor Hines.
I appreciate that perspective, but I also have concern when I hear that the local governments aren't being involved in the process to where,
well, I mean, I wouldn't say, I don't want to say on the record that they're not being involved. I just, that there was a concern a couple of racks ago that there should be more involvement. So I don't know that, I don't want to say there was no involvement up to that point, but that, yeah, there were just some concerns raised that.
I think we can
Yeah.
provide you kind of the details of that. Just, there's no way that DLCD or LCDC is going to engage in any rulemaking that's going to mandate requirements for county governments and not include sufficient county representation during that. It's just not ever going to happen.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, but I think maybe we should provide the information first, because it's just, that's their mandate. They're not going to cut the local governments out of that process. They're just not. Whether or not they have, abilities to participate and show up to every meeting, that's a real and legitimate kind of resource question. But, I can just, I'm not really in a position to speak for DLCD. I just worked long enough with them to know that that is not going to be something that they ever do.
Yeah.
And if you flag participation, I know a lot of local governments remind them.
Yeah, I can go back and look and see. I mean, it wasn't something that I was necessarily focusing on. A lot of my attention was on, okay, what are they proposing and how would that impact our, the citing process for the council? And that's definitely something that we're going to continue to look at. And to be honest, it's hard to, knowing that like there were more changes down the road and it's, it's so long and it's hard to say, well, let's spend, 30 hours analyzing this for, every single possible impact. And then there's 4 more RAC meetings and just the way, it was. So as we get closer to the finish line, we're going to be getting the larger magnifying glass out and taking a more careful look at this. But just due to the bifurcation of the way this is set up, I mean, we're pretty comfortable that this isn't in violation of the review obligation that council has. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to ultimately have impacts. So it likely will. Yeah. All right. Any other? No, I mean, this is just, I've been super interested this whole time too. So, here we are at the council deliberation.
Okay, so this is an action item. Do we have a motion or further discussion?
Chair Howe,
Vice Chair Condon.
thank you, Chair Howe. I am ready to make a motion unless there's discussion beforehand. Mr. Chair, I move that the council affirm the proposed amendments to the Land Conservation and Development Commission rules in OAR Chapter 660 as included in the October 31st, 2024 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, conform to the state policies in ORS 469.010 and ORS 469.310, and that no changes are necessary at this time. However, because there are additional rulemaking advisory meetings scheduled and there could be additional substantive changes to these proposed amendments included in the October 31st, 2024 notice of proposed rulemaking, the council reserves the right to reevaluate these rules for conformance to these policies. And I want to thank Tom for his presentation and delivery of materials beforehand for review.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Do we have a second?
This is,
Counselor Gray.
thank you, this is Council Grail, and I second that motion.
Okay, Secretary Cornett, we have a motion and a second. Could you please call the roll?
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Marcy Grail.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we're about a half hour behind or so. Mr. Jackman, thanks again. Great job. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:10. Okay, it's 10:11, and I'd like to call the meeting back from recess and continue on with the next agenda item, which is an information item, land use standard and goal exception overview provided by Patrick Rowe, the Oregon Department of Justice Senior Assistant Attorney General and counsel to FSEC.
Okay. Hello.
The floor is yours.
Sit over here, different perspective. Can we go to the first slide? Oh, there's Nancy. Well, Nancy will get us to the first slide. I'm going to be providing an overview of goal 3, goal exceptions. We'll talk about your land use standard, statewide land use goals, talk about 2 court decisions that are relevant to these issues. I'll provide a short summary of the most common reasons that you have found merit granting an exception to goal 3, the agricultural lands goal. There's a memo that in your materials that where Sarah and I talk at greater length about the reasons that you have found merit an exception. In the presentation, I'll just provide a short summary. I'll note at the outset, there are a lot of details in the laws, the rules, and the case law, as we've noticed just from our discussion with Tom, governing these issues that we won't have time to get into. So this is very much an overview. I'll also note that this might be familiar to you because I gave you, this is essentially a slightly revised and updated version of the presentation I provided to you about 1.5 years ago. I think it was in June of 23. Okay, Oregon statewide planning goals. Oregon is, I think, probably relatively unique compared to other states in that we have a very comprehensive set of statewide land use planning goals, and they express the state's policies on land use and other issues such as noted here, citizen involvement, housing, natural resources. LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, assisted by DLCD, has adopted these goals. LCDC reviews the county comprehensive plans and the county ordinances to ensure that they're consistent with the goals. So the counties have to look at the goals and they have to make sure, okay, our comprehensive plans and our local ordinances are consistent with the goals. Then they go back to DLCD and LCDC gives them what's called an acknowledgement. They say, okay, we acknowledge that you have incorporated into your comp plans and into your ordinances what you need to do to make sure that they are consistent with our statewide goals. Your land use standard pursuant to statute and your land use standard is essentially just mimics the language that's in the statute. But for you to issue a site certificate, you have to find that a proposed facility complies with the statewide goals. That's what your land use standard is. That's what you're looking at. Is this facility in compliance with the goals? Next slide, please, Nancy. Okay, so how do you go about doing that? How do you find if a facility is in compliance with the statewide goals? Applicants can choose whether to demonstrate compliance with the goals. They can either go to the local government to obtain land use approval. That's what's depicted here in the top green box. You look and you say, well, has the facility received local land use approval? Or you make that determination. Typically, applicants request council review. I think it's in the 6+ years I've been involved, I've never seen an applicant not request council determination of compliance with land use goals. So then you step into the shoes of the local government. And there's too many words in the blue boxes, but there's a couple different ways that you can go about determining compliance with the statewide goals. One is you look at the applicable substantive criteria from, as I just mentioned, the affected local government or governments, if it's in more than one county. You look at their comp plan and their ordinances, the applicable criteria from those ordinances, and you assess, are they in compliance? And if they're in compliance, that means they're in compliance with the statewide goals, because as I mentioned, what the counties do is they adopt their ordinances to make sure that they are consistent. So if they're consistent with the local ordinances, they're consistent with the statewide goals. The applicable substantive criteria from those ordinances. Or if a facility doesn't comply with something in those local criteria, you can determine, well, maybe one or two things it doesn't comply with, but otherwise it does, or an exception is justified, right? And that's what we spend a fair amount of time talking about, especially recently with the solar facilities for which exceptions to Goal 3 are required. There are additional nuances here, but today we're really just focusing on exceptions. So we'll continue with that. Goal 3, agricultural land. Purpose of Goal 3 is to preserve and maintain agricultural lands for farm use. It requires counties to identify farmland designated as such on their comprehensive plan maps and zone it exclusive farm use. So the baseline is this land is set aside for farm use. That's what we want it for. However, within an EFU zone, there can be non-farm uses if it's specifically carved out and allowed for. LCDC has adopted rules addressing how ag lands may be used for non-farm uses. They look in and they say, okay, we'll allow this as long as it won't have a significant adverse effect on accepted farm practices. And as Tom just discussed, and we just discussed, LCDC is looking at the new rules specific to the siting of solar on farmland. Next slide, please, Nancy. Under existing LCDC rule, a solar facility is prohibited from using, occupying, or covering more than 12 acres of high value farmland, 20 acres of, Todd would know, might know off the top of his head, it's high value farmland is the best of the best. And then it goes 20 acres for another category of soils and up from there. But if you're going to be on more than 12 acres of high value farmland, you need to get an exception. And you can get that exception from the county, or you can get it from FSEC. If it's obviously, if they've chosen FSEC review, then they're coming to you for the exception. And as you know, however, for under FSEC's threshold, it's county review, and counties do this a similar but not the same analysis as we've discussed. And I'll show it here on this next slide. The county's analysis of an exception and FSEC's are pretty similar, except as we just discussed during Tom's presentation. So the statute on the left is what governs the exceptions for that, the analysis that local governments apply. Statute on the right is your analysis, mirror images of each other, except for the language that I've highlighted here in yellow. And really what that language is the alternatives analysis. And boiled down, what that means is counties will look at, they have to look at, would the facility, could it be sited on other land that would either not impact agricultural land at all, or could it be sited on other ag lands, but it would have less of an impact on those lands than where you're proposing it? So that, to grant an exception, that's what counties need to do. Chair Howell?
Counselor Grail.
So because I still don't, 'cause all of you are experts in land and I'm trying to learn. When these exceptions are considered, and so I was looking at the slide and it says, an EFU zone places restrictions on developments that are unrelated to agriculture in order to minimize uses that conflict with farming. In my world, coming from labor and working with collective bargaining agreements, there's always this notion that you're looking at the majority, but often cases, things were put into place to protect a minority. So when they're viewing this and we say conflict with farming, and you just said, to look at if it were somewhere else, just from a conceptual theory perspective from myself to understand better, is it a big picture, or is it like, oh, I have this one ranch, this one farm? Is that what it's looking at? Or is it like wide, big area? And I know that's a lot, but because we hear folks talk about like, I have this property and this is what has happened to me. So
they'll engage in what's called the farm impacts test, and that can get pretty specific to, you're going to impact your next door neighbor in a way that's unacceptable.
Okay.
So they'll conduct that analysis in assessing if an exception is merited.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being able to translate me too.
Okay, one other thing on this slide that I want to point out, and I apologize again, it's breaking a cardinal rule of PowerPoint, is that there's way too much on here. But if you look at, and you guys are familiar with this, your statute on the right, A and B, we hardly ever, I don't think I've ever seen A and B. So let's just not worry about those and just look at C, where it says you can provide an exception if the following standards are met. And C, then big letter A says reasons justify why the policy and the applicable goals should not apply. And that's what we spend a lot of time talking about. And we'll talk about it more today, and that's what the memo that's in your materials talks about. But the analysis is always in the draft proposed orders, it's in the proposed orders, and in your final orders of big B and C. We just don't tend to spend as much time talking about those in our meetings, but all three of those criteria. So B is you have to consider significant environmental, economic, social, and energy consequences will be mitigated, right? And the proposed facility is compatible with other adjacent uses. So keep those in mind. I'm going to circle back to that a little bit later in this presentation on how that is potentially relevant to your analysis of a reasons exception. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about two cases that are relevant to this issue. Save Our Rural Oregon. It's an older case, 2005, but still worth being aware of. I'll give you the background here, which is on the slide. This was, I don't even think this thing was ever built, wasn't it, Todd? Yeah, don't worry, but sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. I think it was approved but never built. My record. Yeah, there we go. Anyhow, it was a proposed rather large natural gas facility in Klamath County. Klamath County implement an ordinance implementing goal 3 provided that a commercial energy facility could use maximum of 12 acres high value or 20 acres of non-high value farmland before a goal exception is required. Just similar to what I just described to you. That was their incorporation of the LCDC rule for when an exception requirement is triggered. The facility exceeded that threshold, and so it needed an exception. Okay. FSEC was looking at it. You granted a site certificate, determining that an exception was warranted for the reasons noted on the slide. Proposed facility was at the confluence of 3 unique and essential resources. There was a stable groundwater well, an existing natural gas pipeline, and an existing transmission line and substation. So it's essentially your locational dependence reason. I don't know if they called it that back in 2005, but that's what that was. The council then found the facility would support the existing electrical transmission system. It would benefit the local economy through employment opportunities and contributions to the local tax base. That's still a reason that you pretty regularly apply, but as we'll discuss, that's become more stringent. Your analysis of that reason has been evolving recently, and that it would conserve farmland over the long run. So that's the context, right? FSEC granted it. Those are the reasons that you found justified the exception. Petitioners challenged the council's findings, asserting, among other arguments, that council's order, quote, ignores the myriad of possibilities of alternative locations consistent with the statewide planning goals. Before the Supreme Court, council and the developer argued what petitioners were seeking was an alternatives analysis. And the statutes that we just looked at don't require council to do an alternatives analysis when council, rather than the local government, is the one assessing whether an exception to a goal is required. The Supreme Court agreed with the council based on, again, the comparison of the two statutes that we just reviewed. And the court said, I'll just read the language in italics, we conclude that the legislature did not intend to require council to perform an alternatives analysis in making a determination that an exception could be taken, right? So we have, not just is it, pretty apparent from the language in the statute itself, you have this Supreme Court decision that says, council, you don't, local governments do, but you don't engage in an alternatives analysis when assessing whether an exception is merited. This case is also worth mentioning or bearing in mind because petitioners also argued that there was not substantial evidence to support the council's reasons, those reasons that I just mentioned to you. As we've discussed, and I'll remind you again today, there must be, quote, substantial evidence in the record to support the findings you make. In this context, to support reasons that you determine justify granting an exception. Now, when the Supreme Court is presented with an argument that there hasn't been substantial evidence for something that you've done, the court doesn't decide if they think there was enough evidence, right? It's a little bit more subtle than that. They said, could a reasonable person have concluded that the evidence supported the finding? So maybe they might not necessarily agree, but they say, all right, we understand how council got to that conclusion. There was enough in the record for them to, there was substantial evidence for them to reach the conclusion that that reason was justified. The court rejected the petitioner's argument that there wasn't substantial evidence to support council's granting an exception. Next slide, please, Nancy. The court said the evidence showed that the proximity of the site to the existing natural gas line, to the big transmission line, made the site particularly suited for a gas-powered electricity generation facility. And they said other evidence showed that the facility needed the 50.6 acres. Each of the council's findings was supported by substantial evidence. So I mentioned this just as a good reminder that anytime you do anything, you're making a finding, and in this context, you're finding a reason. Always ask, well, what's the evidence to support this? Is this something that they're just saying, or is there actually documentation or information that they're providing? Because if there's not, and someone challenges it, the Supreme Court is going to look to see if there was substantial evidence in the record to support your findings. All right, so what are the lessons that we learned from this case? We learned that council does not have to do an alternatives analysis when considering whether to grant an exception, and make sure that your findings are supported by substantial evidence. Okay, one more case, and then we'll get off the cases. 1,000 Friends of Oregon against Jackson County. This is a more recent case. This addressed the LCDC rule again, same rule at issue that prohibits a solar PV facility on more than 12 acres of high value farmland. The developer proposed a facility on 80 acres. This didn't come before you. This was Jackson County Board of Commissioners. Jackson County looked at whether An exception was merited, and they based a reasons exception to goal 3. And among the reasons they cited was a demonstrated need for the facility and locational necessity. The need the reason why they said, well, there's a need for this facility was based on another goal, okay, on goal 13, which I've quoted a portion of here. The goal 13 is energy conservation, and it says land and uses developed on the land shall be managed so as to maximize the conservation of all forms of energy. Okay, so when the county looked at this and they said, all right, well, we think an exception to goal 3 is merited because we think that goal 13 establishes a requirement to utilize renewable resources. So essentially they're kind of saying, oh, well, goal 13 trumps goal 3, or goal 13 says, you know, renewable is required. That was the basis for their granting the reasons exception, one of the reasons. That was challenged. County, and you're probably aware of this, but I'll remind you that appeals of your decision go right to the Supreme Court. Appeals of county decisions first go to LUBA, the Land Use Board of Appeals, then the Court of Appeals, and then potentially the Supreme Court. So there's a benefit to your process in that there's a much faster appeal pathway than the county process. So at any rate, the first stop in their appeal process is at LUBA. LUBA looked at it and they said, they rejected the county's rationale. They said, while development of renewable energy is certainly consistent with goal 13, goal 13 doesn't mandate that you develop renewable energy. It's focused on conservation of energy. So then it went up from LUBA, it went to the Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals also rejected the county's position, concluding that goal 13 contains no requirements to utilize renewable energy or any requirements for how land is to be used, does not justify granting an exception to goal 3. All right, so what is the lesson learned here? Goal 13 does not justify taking an exception to goal 3. Nevertheless, after this decision, we still, for a while, I don't know if we've seen it for a year, at least a year now, but we're still fairly consistently seeing applicants making an argument that goal 13 justified an exception to goal 3. The most recent one I'm aware of was in West End. That was 2023. And we consistently would include in the draft proposed orders, and a footnote saying no, and here's why, see this case. So I don't think we've seen that argument as much in the last 12 to 18 months, but it was an argument that we were still seeing pretty regularly, even subsequent to this court decision. I'll also note that this case had a hand in prompting the legislation to pass the bill requiring LCDC to adopt the rules that Tom was just discussing. One aspect of this case that I haven't talked about here was they found that the rural industrial use was not triggered by the solar facility, and now the legislation, as Tom mentioned, one of the things says solar PV does constitute a rural industrial use. That came up in this case, and that's, I think, probably one of the reasons why the legislature put that part of it in the bill. And that legislation also, as Tom was just discussing, required LCDC to establish criteria through which local governments may be permitted or required to allow solar PV. So I think what the legislature saw after this case is like, and we're still wrestling with it now, is, you know, how do we figure out when it's appropriate to site solar on ag lands? And, you know, we will continue. That plays out not just in Oregon, across the country, given how large these solar facilities are getting. This conflict between the development of solar and agricultural land is something that we in Oregon and other states will have to try to sort that out. Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. Now I'll talk briefly again about 3 of the reasons, the most common reasons that you have found justify an exception to goal 3. Again, included in your packet is a memo, a more comprehensive memo summarizing those reasons. one of the ones that we typically look at is it will have, even though it'll be cited on ag land, it will have no or a minimal impact to agriculture. And that might be for a couple of reasons. It might have, you'll look at the land itself on which it is to be cited. You'll say, well, how much is it really impacting that land? What are the direct impacts? How much land, how much ag land will this facility displace? Is that land even being actively farmed right now? Could it be farmed, right? Maybe sometimes it's not, but it is potentially could be farmed. You'll look at the indirect impacts to the land itself. What's the indirect impacts to their overall farming operation? It's just a small percentage and they'll be able to continue farming. Will the revenue from this allow them to expand their farming operations? You'll also, as you know, look at impacts to the surrounding lands and the agricultural economy at large. I'm going to make a note here, and this is just kind of a preview. This evaluation, right, the minimal impacts to agricultural evaluation, it really overlaps with other analyses that you conduct, right? So when I talked about earlier about the B and C, you took up reasons, but you also consider impacts to economic, environmental, and social impacts. That kind of overlaps with this. And it also overlaps with when you're looking at local applicable substantive criteria, it overlaps with that analysis and that farm impacts test that I mentioned, right? And so in a future presentation, Sarah or I will talk to you more about that overlap and whether it makes sense to continue slotting no or minimal impacts under a reasons exception, or should we just be considering these impacts to agriculture under the B and C or under your analysis of compliance with local applicable substantive criteria. So that it's just kind of, I'm just planting that seed right now for you, and we'll flesh that out more in the future. Okay, next.
Excuse me. I would just, the details, I really appreciate, Patrick, and I hope that those who listen and pay attention to our process understand. So every time somebody says, why don't you do it faster? Why does it take so long? This is why it's so thorough. There is no shortcut to evaluating the true impacts, either directly or indirectly. And I know we talk about this frequently amongst ourselves, but I think it's important that that's what you're giving up. Do you want me to just spitball it and hope I'm right, or do you want me to do a thorough job? So I appreciate the examples that you're providing, because some of this I don't know that I would have thought on my own.
Another common reason that you analyze is locational dependence. And you'll look at, is this close to existing energy infrastructure? Is it close to a major transportation corridor? You've often find if those types of criteria are present, then there is a locational dependence reason for justifying exception. And the rationale there is that, look, an exception may be justified even though if it's on ag land, because this particular location really is well suited for an energy facility. And we would rather you cite it here close to existing infrastructure than somewhere else where they're going to have to build more things to get to that infrastructure. Okay. Last up, local economic benefits / benefits to the local agricultural economy. And I put that in there because really in recent years, as noted on the slide, your analysis of this reason has been evolving just since I've been involved. In the past, you would look just at, well, it's going to generate revenue. It's going to increase the tax base. It's going to be a benefit to the county that it's in. That's a justification. But now that these facilities especially are getting so large and they're displacing more ag land, and the goal that they're asking for an exception to is preservation of ag land. Your thinking on this has evolved, and now you're thinking, well, this really what you have to show us is that you're going to benefit. To get an exception to goal 3, you have to show that you're actually that there's going to be a benefit for agriculture in spite of your your project. And so the types of questions that you have been asking more recently are, if this, for example, with regard to the increased tax revenue, well, will those taxes benefit agricultural economy? If the applicant says, well, we're setting up a mitigation fund, you want to know, you've been asking more, well, how is that fund going to be circled back and benefit agriculture, right? And that has been, again, an evolution in the way that you've been looking at this. Most recently, in the Sunstone Solar Project, you found that you looked at the negative impacts that that facility would have, and you compared it to the mitigation fund, and then you found, all right, even considering the negative impacts, the mitigation fund will not only mitigate for those negative impacts, there will be a benefit, a net benefit above and beyond those negative impacts. And that was an evolution in your thinking, because previously you would think, all right, they've shown that there's going to be a benefit to ag, but you hadn't really balanced the benefit compared to the negatives and found that there would still be a net benefit. So Sunstone is really one of the first times that you have engaged in that. So each time these are coming before you, you're thinking about it, a little bit more in depth, and you're really making sure that there will truly be, to grant this exception, a benefit for agriculture. And again, all of these are discussed at more length in the memorandum that's in your materials. So that is all I've got for this. Again, it was a repeat slight update to a prior presentation, but it's always good to double back, to try to cement these concepts in our minds. Okay, any questions?
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. So just as our thinking has evolved, and our decision like on Sunstone is, yep, this is suitable mitigation. We're doing it before the fact and based on modeling. And so as we go forward in the future and 10 years from now, the modeling wasn't quite right. Is it still considered mitigation? Can somebody come back and say, well, the decision was it was mitigated, but there hasn't been mitigation. So is there long-term ability to question?
That would be, depending, I don't think you could claw back something, right? You condition things, but to try to claw back a granting of a site certificate, if 10 years later the facility had already been built, right? You could try to, I don't know, you have discretion in the way you condition things to try to address that to the best of your ability.
Hence my question is, if we find that, or if we decide that mitigation, okay, we're gonna approve with this mitigation, is a companion condition or another condition, should we always consider what if given the long-term nature of these facilities?
Yeah, I just wonder what would that what if look like, right?
No idea. But I'm just considering it. Given, there are a lot of models that have been, have not played out correctly. So.
Yeah, I think the best you can do prospectively is make sure you're reasonably comfortable with the model. Yeah.
And ask the model to look at that future worst case, perhaps. And then the other bit is compliance. Have they complied with the condition to require mitigation, which would be step one. It doesn't get to, is the mitigation enough? I mean, I'm sure there's an argument that the mitigation is never enough, but as part of the economic analysis, and we're seeing some pretty robust analyses, have they considered the worst case? And then the opposite side is, what if the agricultural economy was going to tank anyhow? Even without this project, the mitigation would be well above what that property could have generated. And I think about not having enough moisture, right?
Absolutely.
So it could go either way. And it's like, how big a crystal ball?
Yeah, I guess my thought is, as we deliberate on the subject matter, that we we want a bigger crystal ball.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if you're not comfortable with the modeling, then you would not find
Yeah.
economic benefit to be a reason justifying the
Right.
exception.
Thank you.
Secretary Cornett.
Yeah, and just one more thing to add is sort of a reminder is it's the applicant's burden to provide reasons.
Yeah.
So, what Patrick's giving you is the framework, the kind of the statute, how you've evolved over time, but you're not telling developers you have to do X, Y, and Z to get an approval. It's their burden. It's their burden to say, we're going to submit 2 reasons or 3 reasons or 4 reasons or 5 reasons, and they're going to be these reasons. It's their burden to figure that out. The value of this is, again, just to sort of reset as to where we've been, how your thinking has changed. But again, I want to be careful. So, you're not like, oh, well, we didn't get this reason in the next application. That doesn't mean that the other reasons aren't justifiable for a goal exception. It is the applicant's burden.
Yeah.
To find those. And the reasons aren't a checklist. They are pretty open, as he talked about, there are 3 ways that you can go through a goal exception. Built, the location is physically built and that justifies it, or it is otherwise committed to whatever the use that you're trying to justify in there. None of those really apply typically in our circumstance. It's always the reasons. But that by nature is very subjective and nebulous, and it is very much the burden of the applicant to justify in that particular location, what reasons are they proposing to justify and what reasons are you willing to accept? So, but again, ultimately, their burden to provide, your burden to evaluate and decide if you agree or not.
Yes, and I do understand that. It's that we're deliberating and deciding on the front end, especially with financial mitigation,
Sure.
I guess.
Yeah, this wasn't a response to that,
Yeah.
because it's a legitimate question and a concern, because you can't, once you have said, okay, these reasons justify a goal exception, and then they go out and build the project, you're not going to say, oh, well, you no longer justify, a reasons exception, and you're going to have to go tear the whole thing out. Like, that's not a real practical thing. It would be, how do you perfect that or verify the perfection of that in the future if that's warranted?
Right, and hence my question, is there a companion, should we have a companion?
And that's something I think that the
condition?
council needs to consider, based upon the particular reasons that are being proposed.
Thanks.
So just
Counselor Byer.
a quick question on mitigation. We have tried to tighten up our reasons and our links to the impacts. So any direction you can give us as we put those conditions in. I think the last project was you're impacting dryland wheat. How do you mitigate for that impact? So anything we can do to make that linkage more apparent, because then it is not just write a check. It is a mitigation project that really offsets the impact. So any guidance we can get on how to tighten up how we're thinking about that would be really helpful.
Kind of up on your question or comment about, kind of a companion condition. I'll give you an example, not in the context of economic benefit, but in the context of your locational dependence reason. In West End, you found locational dependence justified that facility because there were 3 existing transmission lines in the area. The companion condition that you included was before you construct, you have to provide us an executed interconnection agreement showing you're actually connecting to one of those lines.
Yeah.
So it depends upon what reason there might be, what companion condition you might come up with is related obviously to the reason that you're providing.
Yes, and what's interesting about that, the infrastructure is easy, it's
Yeah.
easy to, okay, have it, it's physical, as opposed to the financial future.
Which is why I go back to what I said before. I don't know that there is a really good companion condition where you could say, okay, well, this didn't have the benefits that we thought it was. So now, as Todd and I have said, what can you do now, right? It's too late. What I would suggest is, again, I'm just repeating myself, is if you just aren't convinced by their modeling,
Yeah.
then you just say, oh, we're not granting this exception. It's your burden.
Yeah.
You haven't convinced us. We don't think you provided substantial evidence
Yeah.
for us to make that finding.
Well, and it just reminds me of, we recently discussed and deliberated on, and I can't remember the project, but it was wildlife, and there was going to be a contribution to a wildlife recovery center, because there was an issue with the mitigation that was originally found to be adequate was not. And so we didn't say abandon the facility. We said, what's an alternative? And it's the contribution to the wildlife center. And it just strikes me, there might be an ability to say, given a 5-year look, is the economic benefit really there? And if not, there needs to be an adjustment, not abandonment of the facility, but true mitigation. So
That's something you could consider. That'd be worth talking about.
Thanks.
And Chair Howe, just on that note, because this is new stuff, we're just starting to implement these kind of conditions, asking for that 5-year, how's it going? It could be asking the local government or the entity that receives the mitigation funds. There may be no consequences, but at least we know if the mitigation was having the results that we intended, and just say, tell us how it's going, folks. I think we often have conditions on reporting how much energy you're really producing. I mean, at the local level, they say 50 megawatts, which was the sort of cap. And, how much are you really generating? How much is actually getting to the entity, and what are they doing with it? Because if it's not what we intended, then we better rethink what we're implementing. But that might be a partway there kind of thing.
Any other comments, discussion?
Thanks. You're
Council Rowe.
you're easier on me than you were on Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very
Tom
much.
took all the hard questions.
It's good. Okay, so let's see, next item is a public comment period. This time's reserved for the public to address the council regarding any item within council jurisdiction that's not otherwise closed for comment. Items closed for comment include the Mist Underground Natural Gas Storage Facility Amendment 13 draft proposed order, and the Madras Solar Energy Facility Amendment number 1 draft proposed order. So we need to find out how many people are interested in making public comment. Is there anybody here? Okay, none here. So let's check the phone and the WebEx.
At this point, I just have one person with their hand raised. Oh, nope, now I have 2. So the first one up is going to be Wendy King.
Okay. Wendy, or Mrs. King,
It's Wendy King.
go ahead and state your name and address, please.
My name is Wendy King, WendyKing, address 2044 Northwest 20th Court, Redmond, Oregon 97756. Okay, I just have a quick comment concerning the subject matter that was just discussed. And I might suggest that mitigation to dryland wheat adjacent to this solar project might be assistance to other dryland farms to implement irrigation, which would also support wildfire abatement. These lands that are giving up their rights and their irrigation systems for their dryland or their farm operations could be supported in other lands that want to continue with wheat production. And that's all I have to say about that. And my next concern is concerning B2H compliance issue for Myers Farm in Morrow County. Idaho Power has filed an advance occupancy action in the Morrow County Circuit Court to obtain property interests on our farm through eminent domain. The appraisal that IPC provided us determined there was no need for any cost to cure items, or in other words, there would be damages to the remainder of our property, even though the right-of-way goes through and divides our dryland wheat field. While easement negotiation, I'm sorry, is someone trying to speak?
No.
Oh, there must be a microphone still on somewhere. While easement negotiations are outside of the council's jurisdiction, there are promises made by Idaho Power in the presence of FSAC in the contested cases to obtain their original site certificate. And I interpret these as more compliance issues. The promise I'm speaking to is found multiple times in both FSAC and OPUC documents from Idaho Power. You can find one such promise in the IPC response to limited parties exceptions for contested case issues LU9 on July 5th, 2022, page 46 to 47. I quote, additionally, Idaho Power must negotiate an easement for any portion of the ROW or right-of-way located on the land in which Mr. Myers conducts his agriculture operations. When negotiating that easement, the company will work with the landowners of the parcel on which Mr. Meyer conducts his farming operations and will seek to minimize impacts to the extent practicable and will negotiate fair market rate compensation for any damages and or impacts resulting from the project to agriculture operations, including impacts resulting from reduced aerial applications. However, it is important to note that those negotiations will occur outside the council site certificate process. So this can be found in the ODOE's website under B2H Record and Selected Contested Case Files OneDrive. The IPC appraisal to us does not offer any compensation for reduced aerial chemical application to the remainder of our agriculture operations or for the loss of use of our airstrip. It appears that once Idaho Power was granted their certificate, they disregarded the statements and assurances they made. Yet those assurances, I believe, swayed the council toward approval and should be enforced through compliance. Lastly, our farm is still waiting for confidential attachment S10 intensive level survey visual assessment of historical properties report concerning our farm. We did receive a memo prepared by Tetra Tech of surveys from 2023 and that they found a cultural resource. After our additional requests about what that specific resource was, we just learned that when Tetra Tech went back to the site, they couldn't find it and now deem results completely negative due to the agriculture activity in the area and that the resource is no longer eligible. How can we be sure of compliance and accuracy? I have to admit that I am skeptical that the results have vanished to the extent that the project no longer needs to consider them. Our Century Farm homestead is located within 1 mile of the B2H crossing of Little Butter Creek and will experience negative impacts to our viewshed in our historical setting. Is there additional compensation by SFAT for our impacts? Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. King. Any question from council? Okay.
We have a call-in user.
One more. Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute your mic.
Thank you.
Could you please
Thank you.
state your
Can you
name and
hear me?
address?
Hi, this is
Yes, we can hear
Alex Joe. Good. I'm calling you from Sacramento, California, and I've been listening and have attended meetings in the past. Address 2390 Fruit Ridge Road, Suite 368, Sacramento, California, 95822. That's
And could you-
J-O.
Alex Jacob is your name?
My last name is Joe.
Wait. Okay. I think we've got it now. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was just pleased to hear the discussion today, and past discussions have been very helpful too. I know this is a really challenging time period for the development of these energy resources, and they are widespread and constantly changing. So you're doing a good job, and I wanted to acknowledge the fact that you're on the right track. I think too that in listening to the Northwest Power Conservation Council meeting on the 10th earlier this week, they spoke to many needs to consolidate the efforts among these agencies, because it's so important to be able to move with some pace that stays in some ways in front of the need. And I agree with that, and I think they made some outstanding points and would suggest that council members review that meeting if possible, as you have access, with the goal of understanding that agency consolidation of certain processes can make this an easier road toward establishing some of these facilities as they are wanting to be approved. So if that is possible, I think we could probably look at how the regulatory agencies work together with more fluidity to provide the access to oversight of and the development of these much needed resources in a manner that would be advantageous to us in a general sense. So I think all of that being said is good news, and I'm optimistic that, you know, better approvals and monitoring are on the forefront. And again, I want to thank you for the work you do regularly to work your way through all of the applications and assure that the processes are moving forward in an appropriate manner legally, and certainly within the purview of our goal to be able to provide energy for the future. And the demand is high, in addition to the fact that as you develop the procedures, you develop the facilities, the demand is right on the heels of that completion of each one of your projects. So thank you for this opportunity to make these comments.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions from council? Okay, are there any other hands or star three? Nancy?
There are no other hands up at this time.
Okay, and nobody's here that wants to testify, so I guess we'll conclude our public comment and move on to the next item. Mr. Jackman, you're back up again, our rulemaking coordinator, on the initiation of rulemaking alignment phase 2, and this is an action item.
Yes, thank you, Council, for the opportunity to speak on this agenda item. Again, my name is Tom Jackman, for the record. I'm the rulemaking coordinator here to talk about my own rule this time. So, yay! So, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the phase 2 rulemaking, which last we spoke, we initiated the sort of informal process, and had a discussion about that. So here we are today to talk about the initiation of the formal rulemaking period. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So yeah, this is just what I just said. So the interesting thing about this is that normally, or typically we have a rack. So that second chevron there would be development of draft rules with a rack. But as we sort of did our preliminary work on what we narrowing in the scope of the rulemaking to exactly where we felt it should be, it sort of became clear that the rulemaking itself wasn't going to touch on really any substantive rule language. And so it wouldn't really make sense to, go to the same pool of people that I normally go to say, hey, can you give me your time so we can discuss this? I'm going to need them for a whole lot of other stuff. So obviously people are still going to have an opportunity to comment during the formal public comment period. And I would encourage anybody who has any suggestions to make this a rulemaking even better to do so. But of course, if council decides after hearing the rest of this presentation that we should go back and have a rack, we would be happy to do that. So go ahead and go to the next. Any questions about that? Okay. Oh yeah. So why no rack? Yeah. So why don't you just flip through these real quick? So yeah, we narrowed the scope. Go ahead and go to the next one. To non-substantive edits. And yeah, it wasn't worth time for the rack. Yeah. I may have mentally been on this slide already. And we just want to get to phase 3. Everyone's really excited about the phase 3 stuff, which is, the actual modifying the standards, updating them with all the experience and knowledge we have and making them reflect where things are at in 2024, 25, as opposed to when these were initially drafted. Things have changed. So, yeah, so the desire to sort of get to that. And also really some of the things that we were initially thinking about doing in phase 2, it was like, we could do them now, but it would be easier to be more sure that we were doing it correctly if we bundled those edits with the more substantive changes we want to do with phase 3. So go ahead and go. Any questions about that? No? All right. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, and again, if people can provide their comments at the public comment period. Okay. So why are we here? Go ahead, next slide. So the reason for this rulemaking at all is to sort of correct the current layout to be a more easily understood and digested framework. If you're a lay person who's trying to understand, you read the report and you want to go to the rules to understand if you agree, if the standards have been met, if sufficient evidence has been provided. You have, all these standards that are in Division 22, and then you have, A through, we have asterisks down there at the bottom, but it goes through we ran out of letters in the alphabet to the number of exhibits there are, and it can be a bit of a challenge to say, okay, let's go to soil here, and then there's 2 exhibits over here, and which one was J again? Water, what is that connected to? So it can be a bit of a big task to ask for people, frankly, even just onboarding new siting analysts, new council members to say, hey, this is what you're going to have to make a determination about. We could have a college course on this to bring people up to speed. So in an effort to improve, we want to make the standards easier to implement, more accurate, more reflective of the modern day, but we want to do that in a framework that also makes sense. So in thinking about the order of operations in which this takes place, sort of decided let's sort of create the shape that we want, and then we can actually work on the details. So in doing some of the changes that we're going to discuss here in a minute, if we were going to just stop here, if we weren't going to touch the standards, this was just about organizing, and that was going to be it. There was going to be no phase 3. We would be approaching this a little bit differently. So not like what we're proposing today is bad. It's just we've definitely pushed some of the work to phase 3. And if we weren't going to have a phase 3, we would have pulled that back. So if you had any questions about sort of the lack of some of the substantive changes that we might have made, to make them a little bit even more cohesive. It was sort of, trying to optimize when that work should take place. So any questions about how we're structuring this? All right, so go ahead and go to the next slide.
Well, actually.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Counselor Hines.
Thank you. So it's my understanding from reviewing the material that you've organized it in a way that's also helpful for the applicant to follow the actual application according to the standards. Is that correct?
That is the intent. So to the extent you're trying to identify which information is essential to establish that you've met each standard, it should be more clear now.
Right, as to Division 21, which was the old.
Information
Or the
requirements.
current, I should say.
Yeah,
It looks like it was more mixed up,
yes,
right?
yeah,
And you were talking about going back and forth a lot.
yes.
Yeah. And so what we're looking at today, phase 2, is more of a cleanup and organization, but no change to the language.
Yeah, we haven't changed the information requirements at all. So if you're in the middle of an application process, there's questions about how you would present the information, but ultimately the information itself would be unchanged. So I could take somebody who had submitted their stuff here and fit the proposed framework by literally just moving, tabs in the binder around. And then in some cases, maybe combining some tabs. So it wouldn't require any sort of technical work to meet. the
Yeah, I
need.
can see how
Yeah.
this is so beneficial for everyone.
Yeah. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about exactly why we're doing it and what we're doing it. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So yes, my phrase lately, clear as mud. So I only drew lines to the first 5 standards because you can see that even just getting through the first 5, we're already sort of spreading out amongst the information requirements. And so it can be a bit of an ask to try to grasp how that's laid out. And it's, if you do it a lot and you spend a lot of time on it, it's not like it's Greek, but it is harder than it needs to be. So that's what we're here to do today. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So, and the other interesting thing is that the stuff in red, there's no line to draw it to. There's no council standard that directly addresses that. And of course, facility description, the location, some of the stuff in the water exhibit, they can be helpful in determining, understanding the project, in ensuring that local rules and regulations are adhered to, but they're not, you can't say, well, here's the council standard, here's the information that's tied to it. So being able to pull that out and highlighting what that information is used for, I think is also going to be helpful.
So Chair Powell,
Counselor Byer.
just for the record, these exhibits are really helpful to clarify the intent and to show why we need to do this kind of rulemaking. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
I suddenly felt a swell of music as you, yeah, yes. Yeah, no, we're excited about that.
Counselor Hines.
Just wanted to make sure all of the standards are here.
I believe so, yes. Yeah, we have a whole bunch of exhibits, but yeah, that is the list of standards in Division 22.
So, yeah, sorry, for the record, Todd Cornett, in Division 22, there are also
yes.
project-specific standards. So standards for transmission lines, standards for wind projects.
Right.
So there are some other ones that don't exist in Division 22, they're in Division 24, and then
Division
there also
23.
could be some other requirements that sort of, they're not SX standards, but so the DEQ noise rules, they're functionally like a standard. So there are some other things that aren't listed in here that we'll also need to make sure are included as well. But this is, I would say, more illustrative than exhaustive.
But those others will be included. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
These are the standards. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
so yeah, I didn't intend for this slide to be exhaustive. But yes, this is more illustrative. Okay, so go ahead and go to the next slide. So, yeah, not all exhibits are connected to a council standard, which, makes it trickier to identify what information is relevant for the various standards, both in producing it and even in just reviewing it and in storing it in our systems. So it can be confusing where information, this is perhaps even worse, where information is related to a given standard and is spread across multiple exhibits or even parts of exhibits. So then just making sure that, one of the main tasks we have as staff is to ensure that all the information has been provided and, in order to be able to assess these standards. So, it's obviously if you've been doing it for a while, you know what to do and you have a system, but again, it's harder than it needs to be. Go ahead. Any questions? Okay. And then the rules can better explain. So one of the things that we want to do is have the rules set up to where they help people understand where information is required across multiple standards. So in the event you want to cite to information that would be sufficient to, evidence for, recreation, scenic, then we'll make it, we tried to make it a little bit more clear, where this is duplicated across exhibits, but didn't fully address this. So as we sort of update the standards and modernize them, we're going to tackle this third bullet point more fully to really make it crystal clear to the applicant. You need to prove this for this standard, but you can cite to this, to meet this element or whatever, you can cite to the information you submitted for this standard. So yeah, does that make sense? Okay. So we took the exhibits and I literally took the entire exhibit, at least all the substantive stuff. I mean, we had to modify a few words just to connect it to the other material. And we moved it into the relevant standard. So, I mean, that's basically what we've done. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And then it's sort of the other thing that because we spent some time we're so used to the exhibit letters. And we're like, well, do we re-letter them in the new order? But then in phase 3, we're thinking about potentially combining some of these. And then that would, we would maybe lose some letters. So then you have A, B, D, G. And so then I was like, why don't we just call the exhibit what it is? And then, you never have to you don't have to translate anything. So, you're not like, wait, which one was exhibit R or S? And when you have 50 exhibits, it can be helpful to just have shorthand, but the protected areas standard is going to be met with the information in the protected areas exhibit. So
One comment.
Yeah.
For the record, Todd Cornett. And I think this, like any rulemaking where you make changes, people have known these things for so long that there is going to be a transition that's going to be difficult for some people. And we recognize that. People know what exhibit A is and exhibit B is and whatever the exhibit is, and this is going to be create some difficulty for some people. But I think once we get through the transition in the next couple of years, I think it'll just be so much easier and clearer. And, again, not to, minimize the difficulty for some, parties, there will be. And I don't want to say it won't be, and we should recognize that. And we want to think about that as we move forward. But I think the cons of that, do not in any way, shape, or form outweigh the pros of how this is going to work in the future.
Any other comments or questions or thoughts?
Chair Hal, this is Marcy. What I believe this does is it makes it more accessible for the layperson. And that is something we talk about all the time. Well, I hope I like.
As a layperson, it's at the start.
Yes, but I think that is what I see as the intent, because now I don't have to, 8 years you think I'd know and I don't know. So
yeah. Anyway, that's pretty much it. So at least I had some more thoughts about what this phase would be, but it was sort of like, if we're going to do this, then we have to do this. And I was like, let's just do this. And then we can, and then those more substantive rewrites of like the actual, how the information is organized under each standard, were like, because we thought about sort of cleaning that up too, not necessarily changing it, but, you know, making it flow differently or whatever. But it didn't make sense to do that, then have a rulemaking that changed the potentially how the standard is described, and then redoing the language again. So it was just like, no, let's just move it over. Then that makes compliance really easy because it's still just exactly the same as it was before. The information you needed to provide is exactly the same information you need to provide before and after this rulemaking. But then as we tackle each individual standard or, you know, standards, some of these standards we're going to maybe tackle together if it makes sense to do so. You know, then we will start making changes that we're going to require people to reevaluate what they're submitting, either because they don't need to submit it anymore, or because now they need to submit it in a different way, or take new information. You know, so, but
One other comment, if I may. Again, for the record, Todd Cornett. So going back to the phase one, if you recall phase one, you know, between all of these divisions, there was, I would say, a confusing mix of procedural and substantive. So the first phase was breaking out the procedural and substantive and making sure those were articulated clearly. What are the procedural requirements for the division? What are the procedural requirements for the applicants and site certificate holders? And so we did that first because that was confusing, you know, and then now this is the second phase of trying to, again, align the application requirements with the standards. And then the phase three, which is really what everybody wants to get to, us included, is the substantive evaluation. But we're not going to be able to work on them all at one time. And we'll come back to you in January with a list of, here are the phase three rulemakings. What are your priorities for us to work on those, you know, including in 2025? But I don't think we could have done those very well without these first two steps. I mean, we certainly could have done that, but I don't think it would have worked nearly as well. And so I know people have been, you know, hopefully patient enough to get through these because I think this really sets the stage to do those in a clear and meaningful way. And we just wouldn't have been able to do that as well if we had jumped straight into that. So.
Yep.
Counselor Byer?
So I love the structure. I like this idea. I think reminding people why we're doing it, which is to make things easier and more consistent, is a great thing. I'm very supportive of not doing a rack, and usually I would not be supportive of that at all, but it makes so much sense in this context. And knowing that people who are really interested have a chance to comment, great thing. And then your timing on this, when do you expect to, if we approve this, which I won't second guess, but what is your anticipated timing on this?
yes, so perfect segue, because I didn't have a slide on it, but it was my goal. I thought about it afterwards that I needed to bring it up. Todd may have mentioned it to me. Sorry, Secretary Cornett may have mentioned it to me, but it's a pretty set timeline. So legislatively, as soon as I file the notice of proposed rulemaking, it starts a 49-day clock. So there's various deadlines that are shorter than that, but the 49-day one is the legislative comment period, and that's the longest. So because this council meeting is so early in the month, sometimes when the council meeting is late in the month, that means 3 months. When the NOPR goes out earlier, that means we could potentially do it in February, but depending on when the public comment period ends, and the staff report is due for the next council meeting, but March at the latest. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, well, this is an action item.
Yeah, go ahead and go next slide. Oh, yeah, so once we're done with this, we'll be ready for phase three, as Secretary Cornett said.
Do we have a motion?
Chair Howe.
Vice Chair Condon.
Without further discussion, I'm ready to make a motion. Mr. Chair, I move that the council initiate formal proceedings on the rulemaking alignment phase 2 with the scope and objectives recommended in the staff report. Approve staff to file a notice of proposed rulemaking as detailed in attachment 2 to the staff report, and authorize staff to schedule a public hearing during the public comment period.
Okay, we've got a motion. Do we have a second?
Yes, this is Councilmember Braille, and I second that motion.
Okay, motion and a second. Secretary Cornett, could you please call the roll?
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Marcy Grill,
Yes.
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Cindy Condon.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Jackman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item is annual financial assurance evaluation. It's an action item. Cicely Fleming.
Break, grab lunch, and then come back, and then I could do my items.
Yeah.
It's
What's the pleasure, council? You ready to grab some stuff? Take a quick break and grab lunch?
Either way.
Just have a break.
Oh, grab
Yeah.
the lunch.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll just take a 10-minute. We'll come back at 11:35. Okay, you ready, Nancy? Okay, so I'll call the council back to order. It's 11:35, and the next item is the annual financial assurance evaluation presented by Cicely Fleming, a fiscal analyst, and this is an action item, so take it away, Ms. Fleming.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning. For the record, I'm Cicely Fleming, and I'm here to present the next couple of agenda items. We'll start with agenda item F. That's the annual financial assurance evaluation. As you're aware, site certificate holders are required to submit financial assurance in the form of a bond or a letter of credit in a form and by an issuer that has been approved by the council. And that's to ensure that the state has the funding on hand to restore the site in the event that a site certificate holder does not. So each year, the template forms and the list of issuers are evaluated for use the following year. The council last approved the templates for use in 2024 and November of 2023. And no changes have been proposed from those previously approved forms. For the last few years prior to that, we were kind of tweaking those forms a lot and making changes here and there. And we think we've pretty much got them to a place that we're comfortable that no additional changes are needed at this time. And then the next slide. In addition, we review the credit ratings from each of the 4 major creded rating institutions available to make sure that each of the entities on our approved list have, they're still demonstrating sufficient financial strength to act as issuers on behalf of the state. And we found that all of them are still performing well. Ratings are all stable or positive, and in the direction that, provides a good level of confidence that they'll be continuing to be able to act on these bonds or letters of credit should we ever get to that point. And that is really it at this point. Just for additional context for councils, should a site certificate holder decide they'd like to use an entity that's not on the list, or if they needed a change to the form of the bond or a letter of credit template that you've previously provided or approved, they would have the opportunity to come back before council to request those changes at any time as well. So there are still options for flexibility for site certificate holders should this not meet their needs, but this also just gives kind of a convenient starting point so that each site certificate holder doesn't have to come before council for this process. So,
And Mr. Chair, so one
Secretary Cornett.
comment, so for the record, Todd Cornett. Also, this isn't required by rule or statute. So none of this is, sort of regulatorily obligatory. So in addition to, an applicant or a site certificate holder, you can also review these things at any point in time during the year So if something kind of occurs and, you know, even if it's just an idea, we can bring these back. So it's not like you do this now and in 2025, you're obligated to adhere to that and you can't look at it again until the next year. I mean, that's the idea, is it creates some, you know, constancy for people or for developers. But again, should circumstances change throughout the year, you can revisit this at any point in time.
Right. Okay, I guess
Sure.
we're ready for a motion or
Actually, I have
question?
a
Go ahead.
couple, a question and a comment. Counselor Condon for the record. So can you remind us what the level, the rating is that we wouldn't go below? I mean, most of them are A minus ratings.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically, our procedure doesn't necessarily call out, like, this is going to be the rating that we wouldn't allow below, because of course, as you can even just see in this table, each of the entities, they use
Right.
different grading
Right.
systems, if you will, to kind of evaluate that. But what I've adopted through my practices of doing this is I don't like anything below their top three for each of the entities. If I start questioning it, if it falls below any of the top three categories and with each of the entities. And from my research, what I can find, the top three, it's like excellent, outstanding, good. So anything below that good mark, you know, which is basically like the A plus, A plus, if you will, then that's where so I would say we're very, very like pretty strict in that, to see those ratings. So.
And if I can go further, and we recently, I think maybe just over a year ago, where there was certainly in the news with banks that were undercapitalized and I think at that time we reassessed or took a look at what our list was, or certainly questioned, are we impacted by that? And so that's just a piece of that we can look at any time. So if there's something that happens in the financial markets, we always come back and say.
Absolutely, yes. And part of that discussion too was whether council wanted to, you know, direct that it is assessed or evaluated every 6 months or on you know, a greater level of frequency by design. And it was decided that we would just continue to do that as needed. But yes, I do try to keep an eye on all of that just to be sure. And another item to note too, when I was pulling up these ratings, I was really pleased to find that most of them had been issued by these entities in October and November of this year. So they're very current ratings. It's not like, well, this is what they said back in January about each of these. So that gave me a lot more confidence in them as well.
Terrific. And now just further with a comment, and although I'm prepared to offer a motion, before I do that, just with respect to the bond, and the form is fine. I know we've looked at it before, but in reviewing the bond, again, as we do every time it comes up, you notice something that I didn't notice before. And in provision 6, it reads, if the surety provides notice of intent to cancel this bond prior to the principal fulfilling its obligation to retire the facility and restore the site. I don't think we do have this, but I'll continue to read it. But principal does not provide alternate financial assurance approved by the council within 90 days after the date the notice of intent to cancel is received by the obligee from the surety. The surety will be obligated to pay monies to the obligee, the state, limited to the penal sum of this bond upon demand by the obligee prior to the effective date of the cancellation. And I think I'd like to, I guess, have us think about that. Does it accomplish what we want and circumstances might provide for? For instance, we had a project that started construction, so we had a bond for millions of dollars. They terminated after a road was built. Okay, so the investment was 250,000, let's say. With respect to this provision, if a site certificate holder had built a road, and then sometime later, we received a financial institution saying we're going to cancel the bond. As this plays out over time, it just seems to me the amount of the surety, the penal sum, and the penal sum, Councillor Rowe and I looked it up, and the penal sum is the total amount of the bond. And does that make sense? I mean, obviously we'd be able to call on the millions when only X was paid. And so I'd just like to make sure that provision accomplishes not only what we want, but that makes sense.
Right.
So.
And what I understand, and obviously, we've not been through that, but from what I understand is if we were to actually call on a bond, we would actually have to file a claim with the insurance company. So, with the surety. So it would be, I don't think it would ever be we're going to file a claim for the full $13 million if there's only been a road built. There would be that back and forth kind of negotiation, just like if you are filing a claim for a new car through your insurance company. So it would be more of an iterative process. In the case of a letter of credit, I think that would be a lot different. That's why we're not seeing those same types of provisions there. But I think that the concern that you're raising as far as that example, I think would be taken care of through the claims process.
Secretary Cornett.
Thank you. Just in terms of this particular scenario, so when somebody is about to begin construction and we require them to submit a financial, assurance instrument, it is in the amount related to what's being constructed. So if it's, say, $5 million for the entire facility, but they're only building a quarter of that facility, we're not going to make them submit the entire amount. It's going to be 25% of that. And so in the language of the bond, it would be that amount for that portion of the facility.
So,
go ahead.
Councillor Rowe, just correct me if I'm wrong. When we just looked up, and just really briefly, it was in the minutes of a break, the definition of penal sum, and maybe that is the thing for me, is the penal sum used. It's not a portion, it's the penal sum, which
I think we should pull up the actual language, because what I heard, maybe you just read, it said limited to the penal sum, which to me I interpreted as the maximum they would pay.
Exactly.
The cap.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that when we call upon it, they automatically give us that.
Correct.
That's the most they would pay.
Yes.
First, we would go through the steps that Ms. Fleming just described, which is we make a claim and say, this is
Okay.
these are the costs we've incurred.
okay.
Yeah.
And
So and this is, kind of thinking through this on the fly. So again, not the condition, which is the $5 million, but it is actually when they begin construction, they submit 25% of that. That's what's in the bond. That's the amount that they've submitted. That's the amount in the bond. So that's not the penal sum.
I think we might be confusing a few things. Most of the site certificates that I have worked with in, implementing this procedure, it's just, the council has designated that these are the total costs for restoration at XYZ site. Prior to beginning construction, a bond or letter of credit in the amount of that adjusted for future. So I've not actually seen the gradual.
The portions.
Exactly. I know that it's been suggested at times, and perhaps, we might be considering that for some site certificates that are going through the process right now. But for most of the bonds and letters of credits that we're currently operating, they're for the entire amount of.
But for the road example, I don't believe that we required them to submit the entire amount. It was just in the portion of the road.
Right, exactly. So I think that it's site certificate specific,
Right.
but for the most part, it is for a larger amount.
And
But
so that's
that
what I
is
was trying
a
to,
great
this
way.
is just me trying to understand kind
Mhm.
of this conversation as well, is in the context of a penal sum, it would be what is in that particular bond. And say on the road one, it was the amount for that road. It wasn't the amount for the entire facility because the entire facility hadn't been constructed. So
Yeah, and I don't, I remember that the road was built to begin construction, and it was my understanding that we required the bond in the full amount for that project at the beginning of construction. So apologies if I'm wrong. To me, it's just the use of penal sum. Surety will be obligated to pay monies to the obligee limited to the amount of the penal sum of this bond. And if it is that limited to this, here's the amount of this bond, or limited within the amount of the bond. I just want to make sure it reads appropriately for what we like.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
I have a quick question. I think it's.
Counselor Byer?
Thank you. So when we have phased projects, do we need to do anything different with our conditions to allow for a bond only applying to that particular phase of construction? I worry about once there are shovels in the ground and construction starts, that's when I want a bond. But not sure how we've handled a couple of the projects we've seen recently have proposed phases. So want to make sure we put the right conditions.
those
in.
conditions are written in that way right now.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Observation, this is actually highlighting a difference between a letter of credit and a bond, right? A letter of credit is a demand instrument. Letter of credit is for a certain sum, give us that sum. A bond instrument involves a claim adjustment process, the process that Cicely was describing. So under a bond, you actually would go through a claim adjustment process and say, these are the costs we've incurred. They defaulted, and then you would get that fund, that amount.
Okay. Does that complete your presentation, Ms. Fleming?
It
Okay,
does.
on this item. So,
And just another comment, when I looked at the letter of credit, I didn't notice the same cancellation provision either. You know, that we have that running that we do with the bond. And so, yeah, what's the letter of credit, I didn't have an issue with. So with that, I am prepared to make a motion, Chair Powell. So, Mr. Chair, I move that the council approve the recommended templates for the bonds and letters of credit and the recommended list of council-approved financial institutions for use by the site certificate holders in obtaining bonds and letters of credit as presented and recommended by staff.
do we have a second?
Oh, go ahead.
Counselor?
This is Counselor Imes. I second the motion.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. So Secretary Cornett, could you please call the roll?
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yeah.
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Ann Byer.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So Ms. Fleming is here for another one, and it is the biennial fee update. And this is also an action item. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Again, for the record, I'm Cicely Fleming, and we will move on to the biennial fee update. ORS 469441 requires that council adopt a schedule of fees by January 1 of each odd-numbered year to recover the costs associated with the reviews. These fees are intended to be based on the actual historical costs associated with notices of intent, requests for exemption, requests for expedited review, and requests for pipeline under ORS 4694053. In 2013, council began delineating the NOI fees based on proposed generation type. Prior to that, we just had one, I think it was like a $25,000 fee for all notices of intent. And that was, quite problematic when we were having different generation types. And so that's when we figured out that that's how we should kind of break out these fees. For 2025, we're proposing breaking out the notice of intent transmission fee to delineate between pipelines or transmission lines that are larger than 50 miles or less than 50 miles. Because with some of the recent projects that we've seen, those costs associated with that review can be quite different. So that offers a bit of a lower option for those projects that are proposed less than 50 miles. So that's really the big change that we have proposed for 2025, aside from just adjusting some of the fee amounts for inflation. They were pretty consistent in reviewing our historical costs for the last couple of years against our fee schedule. Everything was pretty consistent, so we felt like inflation was just the easiest and the best way to cover those additional costs, should there be any. So everything seems pretty consistent there. And the inflation adjustment, just to be clear, that was adjusting them from first quarter 2023 to first quarter 2025.
And just
Okay.
one note, for the information on here, it's important to point out it's fee for service. So this isn't necessarily what it's going to cost. If it costs less than that, we'll reimburse the applicant, and then they can roll it over into their application, at least from the notice of intent stage. And then if it costs more, we'll bill them for that. So it really is, it's not intended to be, these are the actual costs. These are based on the information that Cicely has evaluated based on our most recent examples of this, to give people an understanding is we think most likely it'll be this, but it won't be exactly that. And it's not a flat fee, it is fee for service. And then once we get into the application phase, why the application isn't on here? Because the statutes require us to do a cost estimate and enter into a cost reimbursement agreement. So that's really a one-off per facility that's done. So it's just a little bit of a clarification. I think sometimes people hear fee schedule and they think this is a flat fee. It's not that.
Question.
Yeah, Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you, Cindy Condon, for the record. So thank you for that, because the question I had, and we have recently experienced B2H, which is a longer transmission line, and with the transmission activity taking place, might there be longer 200-mile transmission? So what I just understood is over 50 miles, greater than 50 miles, it's 100 on the schedule is 159,000. But if it's a 300-mile transmission line that takes more work, it would go up from 159, right? I mean, that.
Right, so their initial fee would be, they would submit the 159,000, and then once that's exhausted, we would invoice them monthly
Yeah, okay.
for all costs that exceeded that to recover those costs.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And one thing, I know we're having some. Okay, it's just ours. We're having some interesting issues going on with our screen. But one of the things is I forget what we call it, a customized notice of intent fee. So with any of these, if somebody thinks, look, we're going to be way less than that, or we're going to be way more than that, they can say, hey, we want to do this customized NOI fee, and here's what we think, here are the circumstances associated with, our notice of intent, why we think it'll be more or less, and then we'll evaluate that as a one-off.
Counselor Byer?
Do we have sort of, and it may be in the biennial report, but do we have kind of a trend line of fees and how much we've collected and sort of the change in the complexity of the reviews that we're doing? Is there any way to measure that?
So on types of projects, so I mean, we have all of the data and we don't put that in our, like the biennial energy report, but Cicely has access to that. And so what are the fees for, notices of intent or applications for this fiscal year versus last fiscal year? I mean, we have all of that information, but I don't think we've ever really kind of produced it in a report format.
Right, but we absolutely could if that was of interest.
Operating costs.
Oh. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
It's just things are so complex.
Yeah, I think that is important. And, one of the 441, I always forget. Yeah, so Oregon Revised Statute 469-441 establishes sort of the authorization to collect fees. And language is, any fees that we collect have to be reasonable, just, and necessary, meaning, there has to be a value to the applicant, the site certificate holder, whether it's compliance or applications or amendments, we track our time very carefully. So we have very detailed tracking systems to make sure whatever hours that we put into a project that is justifiable by, by project, by location, by phase, by sub-phase, by exhibit, by standard, by all of that information. Because developers have the opportunity through the statute also to take us to circuit court and challenge, any of those fees. So we have that information. We've had that for quite some time. So any fees that we charge, we've only had one that I'm aware of, and it wasn't a challenge to circuit court, but Cicely and I went and met with the developer.
Right.
It's been 10 years ago or something.
Yeah, at least.
And we were able to justify all the information.
Exactly. It was more just, communication at that point and sharing the information. It wasn't that there was any real concern over whether or not charges were being places or allocated to a project that unnecessarily. And that's something that I take a lot of pride in, I think, is that to make sure that everything that we are charging to a developer is absolutely necessary, just, and reasonable. And on the flip side, if it's been charged there, I take a lot of pride in making sure that we recover those funds for the state. So, yeah, we definitely have our hands on that.
But, and even though it's not necessarily related to the fees, a good example of that is every council meeting. So, when you sign your form to get reimbursement, you're signing that because that's the sort of distance that you travel. But what you're not seeing on the back end is when Nancy's putting together the schedule and then having the conversations with each of the staff members who have an agenda item to say, what do you think the time is going to be associated with that, that agenda item, and that's what goes on your timeline. But it's not just for, this is our forecasted timeline. The meeting costs are prorated based upon each cost account associated with those agenda items. So, if we're driving to, Boardman, for a project and the majority of that, council agenda is for that, they're going to pay the majority of the cost. It'll be prorated if we have rulemaking or if we have others, so everything gets really prorated. So if any of these costs that we charge anybody, we can defend, in the court, if necessary. And obviously that doesn't happen, but I think it's also good practice to make sure that we, are not spending, we're not just saying, well, last week was a 40-hour week and I think I spent 30 hours on this project. No, day by day, hour by hour, exactly what was spent on that project. So, that's, kind of getting to your point, all of that information Cicely evaluates on a monthly basis. That's what goes into what we charge people. And that's all that information that kind of feeds into, this fee schedule on a biennial basis.
Councilor Byer?
Thank you, because we often don't see the behind the curtain kind of hard work that's being done. And it's good to know that you're taking care of this. So thank you.
Yeah, just as a side note, Cicely's a master on Excel.
That's very kind.
Okay, any further discussion, comments, questions? This is an action item. Someone want to make a motion?
Chair Howell, I'm ready to make a motion.
Okay,
I move that the council approve the 2025-2026 schedule of fees as presented by staff. Excellently by staff.
do we have a second? Councilor Byer?
I second that motion.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Secretary Cornett, could you please call the roll?
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Ken Howe.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. And we do have an order that we'll have for signature. Statute requires, council approve this by order. So this one's a little bit more formal than the last one, but so we'll have that for you. Thank you all so much.
okay.
Apologies on the screen. Everything's fine online. something going on in my.
I know.
Just kind of go with the flow.
Okay, so the next item is the 2025 annual election of officers. It's an action item. Secretary Cornett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the annual items that we do, we typically, kind of starting as early as November and kind of going through January, we have a list of things that we have to do every year. And one of those, per the administrative rule, if you can read it on the screen, next slide, please, is annually the council will elect a chair and a vice chair. And so that is the requirement. And ultimately, that is, your choice as to, who's that's going to be. It can be the same people, you can mix and match. It just, it's really the whatever it is that the council is interested in. So there are 3 potential motions. One is election of chair and vice chair, or the other 2 are having those separate. So really there's interest in those who want to nominate somebody or who want to indicate their interest in serving. I will just sort of turn it over for you for discussion.
That's the question.
Counselor Byer.
Not trying to presume anything, but would our current chair and vice chair be interested in another term? I should have talked about this offline, but I think there's some wisdom in carrying over, but I would, whatever is the pleasure.
I was saying earlier that I thought it's a good idea to rotate. And this is my last year coming up. And so this year went by very quickly. And I'm fine with doing it for another year. Vice Chair Condon.
And I am as well. I'm learning from a master. So,
And I just, as you said, things went so fast.
Yeah, doing.
I think we can all learn from you.
just a comment, if I can make.
Yeah, Vice Chair Condon.
I only substituted once for Kent, interestingly enough, right after
Yeah.
right after the term started. But one of the things that I found is, as chair, and Councillor Grail knows about this, is, there's the process of the meeting itself and then participating in the discussion. I mean, they are really different positions. So I certainly have found it helpful to at least be at the ready to step in if can't be there, but understand that the discussion doesn't remove me from the discussion, but it's different.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Any further discussion? Well, someone want to make a motion? Councillor Byer.
Certainly, since I broached the subject, I would make a motion that we retain Chair Howe as our chair for the upcoming year and Vice Chair Condon in her role for the next year, and thank them both for their service and continued hard work.
Is there a second?
This is Marcy Brill. I second that motion and appreciate your willingness to continue serving.
Had a good model to follow.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and a second.
And I don't believe those who are nominated have to recuse themselves from the vote. I think you can vote. That has been historically the practice. And particularly because if you don't, we would need one of you at least in order to make the vote count.
Okay, Secretary Cornett, could you please call the roll?
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Katie Imes.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you all. Is there any comments for good of the order? Vice Chair Condon?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy Condon for the record. I just want to make a statement, given the rules that the rulemaking process that Mr. Jackman presented and we spent time doing, the importance of doing it now, to me is essential, given that we have two long-term members of the council who have much more experience, broader experience with working with the rules, the exhibits, and having that input. I'm afraid to lose the expertise.
2026, 10 years at the end.
Yeah, and that's a long time and it's a long time of experience in a changing market, and the expertise that you have in not just the rulemaking as we make that change, but everything in general as the moving parts. So, yeah, I'm hoping we move quickly through it and have your counsel.
Well, it's also an exceptionally fantastic staff that bring the stuff to us that's well prepared and in formats that we can understand, and it's the staff. Okay, any other comments for good of the order?
Happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays to everybody. Okay. The time is 12:09. Is that right? Yeah. And December 13th, 2024 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council is now adjourned.